Welcome. I'm Tim Jones, the Acting Director for the Division of Wetlands and Waterways at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, otherwise known as MassDEP. Thank you all for coming out tonight. And for those viewing at home, thank you for joining virtually. I'm going to start with a few housekeeping rules and comments. The first is you need to know that this is being recorded tonight, and the recording will be posted on MassDEP's website afterwards, along with all of the slides from the presentations you'll see tonight. The other housekeeping item that I need to tell you about is that in the unlikely event of an emergency, please exit the way you entered. Note the exits on either aisle behind you, and please note there is a stairwell on the exit to my right here. There's one accessible restroom on this floor and additional restrooms downstairs. Please enjoy snacks in the lobby and water only in the theater, please. Okay, with that out of the way, let's focus on tonight. This is a public information session for the FirstLight water quality certification proceeding. It's not a public hearing. They are different. This session is focused on providing you with information and then answering questions, not solely taking public comment. We've been working for several weeks to put together an information session that we believe will provide you with a good understanding of the certification process and some of the issues at stake. I hope you walk away tonight feeling like you know more about the process, MassDEP's obligations in the process, and some of the issues at stake. To help do that, there are a number of state agency representatives here, and at this point, I'll have them introduce themselves, starting first with my colleague from MassDEP.
Good evening. I'm David Hilgeman with the Wetlands Program, MassDEP.
Hi, my name is Jesse Leddick. I'm the Assistant Director of Mass Wildlife's Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program.
I'm Caleb Slater, and I'm a fisheries biologist with Mass Wildlife.
My name is Paul Janegy. I'm the director of the Massachusetts Office of Outdoor Recreation. I'm actually speaking here tonight on behalf of the Department of Conservation and Recreation, who I formerly worked for.
Thank you. And also helping us tonight are the Consensus Building Institute and the Donahue Institute at UMass Amherst. The Consensus Building Institute is here to help facilitate the information session, and technical staff from the Donahue Institute will be helping as well. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Stacy Smith from the Consensus Building Institute. Stacy?
All right, thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many people here. As you heard, my name is Stacy Smith. I am a facilitator from the Consensus Building Institute. I'm managing director there. CBI, as we call ourselves. We're a nonprofit organization. We're headquartered here in Massachusetts. We work all over the globe. Our job here tonight is to make sure that this is an informative and a constructive meeting. That's why we're here. So, here are our goals. We want this to be an opportunity for all of you, as Tim said, to learn about the water quality certification process, about DEP's role, get a chance to really hear from key agencies and officials from DEP, from the Massachusetts Division of Fish and Wildlife, and from the perspective of the Department of Conservation and Recreation, about their roles, their mandates, the analysis and thinking that they have been doing on the issues related to this water quality certification process. And most importantly, this is an opportunity for you to ask questions and to get answers about this process and about the key topics involved in this process. As Tim said, it is not a public comment period. We hope that you will take advantage of this opportunity to ask questions and to get answers. Public comments will not be added into the record because it's not a public comment time. There is an opportunity for you to share comments. There's a website, and you can use that to share any comments you might have. We are really hoping you will focus on asking questions. So our agenda is designed to be interactive and to give a chance so it's not just present, and then you ask questions. Instead, we are breaking up the presentations into 4 different themes, topics, so that then after each one, you will have a chance to ask questions related to that topic. Now, this is tricky because you might have come with a question about the topic we're going to talk about last and you want to ask it first. We're going to ask you if you possibly can to hold your question till we get to that topic, because you might get that answered by the presentation itself. If you have questions and you want that aren't on those topics and you're either not able to stay or for some reason need to leave, we have note cards and pencils. So you can feel free to write them down, and any questions that either are left here or that don't get asked live during the time of today's meeting are going to be answered thematically and posted on the website. I'll get to that in one sec. The slide will be on there. Thank you. Okay, so let me just go through the agenda. So the first presentation you're going to hear is about the process, right? What is the water quality certification process? What is DEP's role? What is their mandate? What is their jurisdiction, right? What's happened so far? What's going to be happening next? It's really a process-oriented presentation so that those of you who may be less familiar with the process get a chance to really hear about what is this process? How does it work? Where are we, right? How does this all fit in? So after we hear from Tim giving that overview, we'll have a chance for questions about the process, right? So we'll pause for that. Then we will move on to a presentation about erosion and the impairments from MassDEP. And again, we will stop and take questions about erosion and the impairments. Right. We will take a break, so we know this is an awfully long meeting. People can stand up, stretch their legs, get some more water or refreshments. When we come back, we'll hear a presentation about flows and fish, right? And how does this fit in to the process? What's the analyses so far, the work done to date, et cetera? And then we'll take questions about that. And lastly, about recreation and water quality. And then we'll take questions about recreation and water quality. When we finish those 4 presentations, and we will have some limits to how long we take questions for each of those. So there may still be unanswered questions after that. We'll take a few minutes to just present some next steps. And then if you've had your questions answered and you're hungry or you're tired and you want to go home, we'll give people a chance to get up. Those who still have questions, we'll invite you to move on down. We'll get closer together. And at that point, we'll open it up for all remaining questions on any topic. And we'll stay here until they kick us out at 10 o'clock. Okay? Okay. So as I said, we will have a chance for targeted questions after each presentation. As you heard, we have lots of people here in person. We also have some people joining us by Zoom. So when we take questions, we're going to go back and forth between the room and the Zoom. And so we'll invite you at the time that it's question time to raise your hand. We have a team from the Donahue Institute are going to be helping us walk around with mics. They will come to you, we'll call on you, you'll have a chance to ask your question live. The panel will figure out who's the best person to answer that question. They will answer your questions. We'll confirm that your questions have been answered, and we'll move on to the next question from the Zoom, and we'll come back to the room, and we'll go back and forth. I also want to mention that the presentations on all of these topics are designed to both provide an overview for people who may not have been deeply engaged in these issues already. So if you're new to these topics, welcome. We will the presentations hopefully will really try to explain the big picture and where we are and how it all fits together. But we also know that some of you are deeply, deeply embedded in these issues and very interested and may have very detailed questions. And so the presentations are meant to also provide some detail, right? So we're really trying to do a mix of those things within each of these presentations. At the end of each of the topics that are going to be talked about that I said before, we will hear back from DEP, from Tim, who will share, here's what we've heard from the public comments so far. As you may know, there was already one public comment period. Those comments have been synthesized, the themes have been sorted, and we want to present, DEP wants to present to you, here's what we've heard already from the public about what you're concerned about on these issues, and here's how DEP is thinking about them. So that'll follow each of the thematic presentations before we go to question and answer. Okay. So as we mentioned, not public comment period, but there is, I don't know where to point. Oh yes, I do want to make sure those, yes, please be concise in the asking of your question. As you can see, there's lots of people here who might have questions. For those on the Zoom, trying to get there. There we go. For those on the Zoom, there is a little question and answer button. So that's going to be the place for you to put in your questions. And if you can, hold your questions and also try to ask them by theme and topic. That's going to make it much, much easier for our team. All right, here is the website. As you can see, it's a little, you could take a picture of that. It's going to be, but you could also just Google MassDEP FirstLight and you will get to the website. And that's where you can share any comments. You'll also get, this is where the recording will be posted, as well as the document with any additional questions being answered. Okay. One last thing before I get to the ground rules. We do have a team from FirstLight who have agreed to be here. If you want to just stand up and wave to people so they know who you are. There may be people who have questions for FirstLight. You're not going to be able to ask them those questions here tonight. It's not their meeting. We're not letting them answer. But they're here, so now you know who they are. So when we're at the break, you can feel free to go and ask them your questions, or at the end of the night. Similarly, Josh Ryer is here from the office, Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. If if you have questions about the energy side of this process, again, we're not going to let Josh answer them tonight, but now you know where he is, who he is, and you can find him. And if you want to email them, you could email them at doer.energy@mass.gov. Okay, let me quickly make some requests for you for a constructive meeting. Please try to listen with an open mind. Our presenters have actually put in a lot of work trying to give you the information that they think will be of interest to you. And so I hope you will really take the chance to listen and really try to absorb that. And try to understand what is it that they are saying. And then we welcome you to ask really pointed, important questions, right? Things that really matter to you. But we ask you to do that with respect and without attacking anyone, showing respect to each other, all your other neighbors and friends who are here tonight as well. We're going to ask you to try and help us stay on topic and on time. Just the more clearly you can and pointedly you can ask your questions so that they know how to answer them, the better. Okay, with that, I'd like to hand this back over to Tim.
Thank you, Stacey. Is this working? Yes. Okay, I'm going to give you an overview of the certification process and walk you through our obligations in the process, what our work involves, what we're required to do according to law. DEP's goals for this information session are to provide you with a good understanding of our obligations in the process, help you understand the process itself, how it works, and then last, provide you with a broad perspective of some of the issues at stake for the aquatic health of the Connecticut River. Not sure, there we go. All right, many of you already are very familiar with the facility, but for those of you who are not, I'll give you a brief overview. And we'll start here, down at the bottom. This is Cabot Station. Cabot Station has several turbines which are powered by water that flows through the power canal, which is approximately, I believe, 2 miles long. And then just to the north of the power canal is the bypass area. And that has water flowing through it from the dam and the bascule gates at the dam. So you have water flowing through the power canal into Cabot Station turbines. And they also flow through station number 1. There are a number of turbines there as well. And then that water flows into the bypass channel and then down to the bottom of Cabot Station. This is the dam. And then if you go east and north, you can see the upper reservoir here. And then directly below the reservoir are the intake structures where water is taken in and pumped up to the reservoir. And then when energy is generated, the water flows back down through the turbines and back into the river. The area that you see in purple is known as Turner's Falls Impoundment. It runs from the dam all the way up to Vermont and the Vernon Dam in Vermont. All right, introduction to the certification process. How did this process start? Well, it first really started when FirstLight filed their application for relicensing with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, otherwise known as FERC, to relicense the hydroelectric facilities in Turner's Falls, Montague, and Northfield. As part of that FERC process, FirstLight must also apply for a 401 water quality certification from us, MassDEP. Tonight, we'll provide you with a broad overview of our ongoing certification process. We recognize the importance of this project to all of you. And because of that, we've expanded the ordinary public process that we would provide. We started expanding the public process with a 35-day public comment period that expired in June and held 2 virtual public hearings, one in the afternoon and one in the evening on May 29th. Tonight, we're here for this public information session. And then in December, early January, we intend to issue a decision, and we'll hold a public hearing and public comment period on the decision. And the deadline for the final decision is April 22nd, 2025. So what governs the certification process? What do we have to follow as MassDEP during the certification process? We have to ultimately ask the overarching question, which is, will the relicense operation of the facility, FirstLight's facility, comply with the Massachusetts surface water quality standards and other water quality related laws? To answer that question, there are several other issues that we have to address. The first is, will the operations provide the water quality and the water quantity that support existing and designated uses and address impairments? What are designated uses? Those are defined by the water quality standards, 314 CMR 4.00. And they're defined as these: fish habitat, other aquatic life, wildlife, water-related recreation, fishing, boating, irrigation, compatible industrial cooling, process use, and consistently good aesthetic value. Existing uses are those designated uses and other uses that have been attained in a water body on or after November 28, 1975. That last statement, the existing use, is from the Federal Clean Water Act that was enacted back in the 70s by Congress. And it's designed essentially to prevent what they call anti-degradation. In other words, the water quality getting worse and adverse impacts to sensitive aquatic life. What's sensitive aquatic life? Well, in this case, we have 2 examples of sensitive aquatic life. One is known as the tufted hairgrass, which is endangered. The other is known as Tridescent aster, which is threatened. 2 plants that live in the Connecticut River, mostly on the downside of the dam in the bypass area. Those plants were living after 1975, and because of that, they are known as existing uses and sensitive uses that have to be protected. Our obligation in the certification process is to grant, deny, or waive issuance of the certification. And importantly, we can also establish conditions that are necessary to issue the certification, which FERC must incorporate into its renewed federal license if they're related to water quality. Examples of conditions that may be necessary to issue a certification: requirements to repair erosion caused by facility operations and monitor to prevent future erosion caused by the facility. Install a barrier net in front of the Northfield intake structure to prevent fish intake. Install fish ladders and lifts to facilitate fish passage over the dam, and increase water flow in the river to help sustain and promote aquatic life. I know many of you have this question because I've read a lot of the public comments, and I was at the public hearings when many commented. How could a river with a hydropower facility possibly meet water quality standards? There are three answers. One, the facility and many like it were in existence when the Clean Water Act was passed in the 70s, and many have also come into existence since then. So to address that, the law focuses on whether the water quality supports what I mentioned previously, the designated and existing uses, despite the facility. In other words, whether they can coexist, whether the designated uses can be supported, whether the existing uses can be supported despite the facility. And last, the Connecticut River is known as a Class B water, and because of that, permissible uses include irrigation, other agricultural uses, and compatible industrial cooling and process uses like a hydropower facility. What can we, MassDEP, consider in this process? FirstLight's application, which was filed with dozens of supporting documents and scientific studies and other information that is submitted during the certification process. Public comments that are relevant to the water quality standards, and we've received many. Thank you for all the people who've been participating and providing public comments and attending the public hearings that we held. Settlement agreements reached in the FERC process. I'll be talking more about the settlement agreements in the next few slides. And last, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, and the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife 2024 comments, recommendations, and preliminary prescriptions. There's a lot of words. I'll elaborate on what they mean in the next few slides, as well as the settlement agreements as well. But these are all the things that we can consider during the certification process. What we can't consider, what's outside of our jurisdiction by law. Decommissioning or establishing a decommissioning fund for the facility, altering the facility or operations for energy-related reasons, the license term, tribal, historic, and cultural interests that are not related to water quality standards, and economic, social, and societal impacts. I mentioned I was going to talk to you about the settlement agreements on the slide that was up a while back about what we can consider. In this case, the settlement agreements were reached in 2023. And how did they come about? Well, FERC has a process to facilitate settlement agreements, and FERC looks with great favor on settlement agreements. And they look to see whether there's substantial evidence in deciding whether to adopt those settlement agreements as licensed terms in the license that may be issued to FirstLight. As I mentioned, the agreements were reached in 2023 with many stakeholders after engaging in years of scientific studies and negotiations. MassDEP, that's us, chose not to participate in the settlement agreements in order to remain independent for the certification proceedings and not be bound by the agreements. Here are the agreements. There were two agreements that were reached. Both were filed with FERC in 2023. The first settlement agreement was filed in March 2023, and it's known as the Flows and Fish Passage Settlement Agreement. Some of the notable signatories, there were several more, but some of the notable signatories include U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Massachusetts Division of Fish and Wildlife, the Nature Conservancy, New England Flow, a hydropower reform coalition. The agreement resolved issues pertaining to fish passage, flows for fish, ecological conservation, some recreation purposes, and protected, threatened, and endangered species. You'll be hearing more about aspects of that settlement agreement from our friends at Mass Wildlife. The second agreement is the Recreation Settlement Agreement. Some notable signatories to that agreement include Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation, the towns of Irving, Gill, Montague, and Northfield, and the Franklin Regional Council of Governments. It's noteworthy that the terms of these agreements were included in the certification application that was filed with MassDEP. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, and Mass Wildlife comments, recommendations, and prescriptions were another piece of information I mentioned earlier that we can consider. And how these came about and what they are is based upon the Federal Power Act, which governs a lot of what FERC does in these proceedings. And Section 10J of the Federal Power Act requires FERC to include in the license U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, and Mass Wildlife conditions for the protection, mitigation, or enhancement of fish and wildlife. So these are documents that these federal agencies filed with FERC with their comments and their recommendations and what are known as prescriptions concerning protection, mitigation, or enhancement of fish and wildlife. And these can only be rejected by FERC and not be included in the license if they're inconsistent with federal law. A related determination that FERC makes is whether it serves the public interest by balancing the power and non-power values to be considered in its license decision. And last, this pertains to the term up there, prescriptions, fish prescriptions. Section 18 of the Federal Power Act mandates incorporation of U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service prescriptions for all measures relating to fish passage into the FERC license. What are prescriptions? They're essentially conditions that require implementation of measures to facilitate fish passage over the dam, upstream and downstream. Why are these important? Why are the settlement agreements and why are the federal comments, recommendations, and prescriptions important? Well, first, as I mentioned before, FERC strongly favors incorporation of the settlement agreements into the FERC license. The Mass Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and National Marine Fisheries Service comments, recommendations, and prescriptions were based upon, and endorsed the Flows and Fish Settlement Agreement. These are the agencies that are the fish and wildlife experts. And it's noteworthy that inconsistencies between the certification and settlements could unravel the settlements. Therefore, there's a high probability that the Flows and Fish Settlement Agreement terms will be included as terms in the FERC license. If there's a conflict between the certification and those provisions in the FERC license, it may ultimately be resolved in court with an uncertain outcome. What to expect tonight? My colleague from MassDEP, David Hilgeman, will present an overview of information that we're considering regarding erosion and possible ways to address erosion, followed by a question and answer session. Next, Mass Wildlife will present information on river flows and aquatic life, followed by related public comments and a question and answer session. And then last, the Department of Conservation and Recreation will present information related to water-related recreation pertaining to the settlement agreement. followed again by a question and answer session. There are limits that we have to place on discussion tonight. And that's because we're in the middle right now, almost precisely in the middle of the certification process. The process itself has to be completed within a year. And because we're in the middle of that certification process, we can't comment on what specifically we intend to do or would like to do for the certification. Or we can't comment on our views about the evidence. What comes after tonight? 2 more opportunities for public participation. We intend to issue the draft decision in December or early January, followed by a written comment period and virtual public hearing. And then the certification decision has to be issued by April 22nd, 2025, a year after the application was filed. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tim. So we'd like to have an opportunity for questions about the process, so about what you just heard from Tim about what DEP can do, what the water quality certification is built on, what they can consider, et cetera. So any questions that you have related to this, we have a couple of our team members, John and Stephanie, no, yes, will be coming around with mics. So raise your hand. So John, there's one person right behind you.
Hi, my name is Chris Hinkle. I live in Northfield. So I have a question about what you can consider in this process. And I'd like to ask the question, and I'm not going to take too long, I promise. I'd like to offer a metaphor to help illustrate the question and provide some context. So the question is, can you consider the purpose of the facility, specifically the purpose of the Northfield pump storage facility, when you're making evaluations? And the metaphor would be, we've all seen a kid thrashing the trunk of a tree with a stick, and we can evaluate how good or bad that is for the tree, but essentially no amount of damage to that tree is really worth it. You just tell the kid to stop. The context being that I think nuclear power in this country was often misconstrued, the evaluation of how much bang we get for our buck. Public safety was often a misrepresented aspect of nuclear energy. With respect to the Northfield Mountain Pump Storage Facility, the purpose of the facility was very clear, I think, to everyone when it was associated with the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant. My question is, now that that's gone, is this purpose in its current form a part of your evaluation when you're evaluating the water quality standards? Thank you.
Tim.
We have to, when we're in the certification process, we have to consider the application as filed and as filed with FERC during the relicensing. And the application itself was filed for a relicensing of the continued operation and purpose of the facility as it's been operating for the last several years, since the early 70s, the pump storage station or operation. Otherwise, we cannot consider, I mean, that's what we have to consider, take the facility as it's applied for in the FERC license. I hope that answers your question.
I think it does.
Great, thank you. Stephanie, do you have someone for me? Yeah. Oh, before we take that, Sonia, someone online?
Yes, just one moment. I'm not sure, this might be more for the water quality section later on with recreation, but one question we've received is, does DEP monitor water quality coming out of the NMPS outfall into the river? And this is by Don Ogden. Should we hold that question until the recreation section?
No, the question is, do we presently monitor the water quality coming out of the outlet from the Northfield Reservoir, correct?
Northfield Mountain Pump Station, I believe.
Yes,
Yes,
correct.
outfall.
I don't believe we do presently, no.
So
Well, let me add this, though. There is a water quality monitoring program as part of DEP, and they are required to monitor the water and test the water every couple of years. I don't know specifically what they do, though, with regard to water coming out of the reservoir.
So I do want to just add, there are times you may ask a question that we don't have all of the information. We are making note of that. And when we, as you heard from Tim, not all questions can be answered, as he said, since they're in the middle of the process. But if you ask a question, a factual question that we can get back to you with an answer with, we will try to include that in the document that we post at the end of this at this session. Okay, yes. John, was there someone else? Oh, no, sorry, Stephanie, yes.
Hi, I'm Ariel Elan from Montague. Trying to narrow my 6 questions down to 2, but I'll follow up this one too, because I'm with a friend who says that when kayaking downflow, he can smell pollution quite a bit. So my question to DEP about that, this is first of 3 questions. Question to you all is, are you interested in obtaining the data on significant, from your own people, on significant pollution testing there as part of your determinations? First, that's my first question.
Can I just be clear? The question is, do we monitor the air quality?
Air and water quality.
Air quality? No, we don't do that. And
Water quality.
or the water quality coming out of the intake structure that go up to Northfield Mountain?
Both ways.
Yeah, I don't believe so.
My question about that was, are you interested in obtaining that data from your own people? As part of your deliberations?
The question is, are we interested in getting that data from our own people?
Yes, and including it in your determination of what you're going to recommend.
Well, I don't believe the data exists for water coming out of the reservoir.
Oh, sorry, I thought a minute ago you said that you had a division that could monitor that could measure that. Okay, I know there's a lot to do, so next one. Within the laws and guidelines that you just described, you're saying basically you're looking at the existing situation with the facility already there. So if there's a possibility that those are already degraded conditions from what would be better conditions for the river, okay, if the DEP can't advocate for that, what other agencies or processes would you refer us to advocate for improvement after 50 years of experience rather than same old, same old? Where would you send us?
Are you referring to changing the facility itself and the purpose of the facility? Is that what you're saying?
You've basically said that you're evaluating based on existing conditions, not trying to better the conditions. So, okay, if DEP isn't in a position to advocate for bettering the condition of the river with this facility in place, where do we go? Just tell us.
Well, I think there may have been a misunderstanding or misperception of what I was saying. As part of the certification process, we can impose conditions to improve water quality, aspects related to water quality conditions. We can do that.
Good. Including fish flows.
Including fish flows, correct.
Okay, good to know. Last question. Why, in the settlement agreements that you referred to, I mean, we all know that it was very, very difficult for organizations like the Nature Conservancy to even decide whether to participate because there were tremendous conditions of secrecy. Nothing was to be discussed from their deliberations with the public, or even different organizations just discussing what they were talking about and what evidence they were presenting with each other. Under those circumstances, would DEP take a stand and say that that was inadequate, that the input to those settlement agreements was inadequate, and that DEP, having kept itself independent of those discussions, is not going to simply accept and rubber stamp those settlements?
I don't have the same understanding of those settlement agreements that you do. My understanding is that there was a robust process that was engaged in for a number of years involving multiple stakeholders who also happen to be experts in the fish and wildlife area who signed on to the settlement agreement. I was not involved in the settlement process, so I can't comment on what was actually involved in the process itself.
Great, thank you. There are just a lot of people, so we want to make sure others get a chance. Sonia?
Okay, one moment. Actually, here. Okay, we have a question from Arlie Gold. The question is, how enforceable are the settlement agreements incorporated into the license? And what happens when the company decides not to do them? So I think the question might be, what happens when if the company decides not to do them?
Right. So the question, as I understand it, is once the settlement agreements are incorporated into the license, if they're incorporated into the license, and as I mentioned before, there's a high likelihood that they will be incorporated into the license, how can they be enforced? Well, by that point, once they're incorporated into the license, they will be terms of that license, required terms of that license that can be enforced by FERC as part of the license.
Thank you. Yes, please. And let John give you the mic.
Oh, thanks. Hi, I'm Sarah Matthews. I'm with Western Mass Rights of Nature, and I'm also an attorney. So I have a procedural question. So, and we've provided comments that, I hope you take into consideration. But since that time, since the public hearing that you held, scientists at Connecticut River Conservancy and UMass have been doing eDNA testing and found strong evidence of short-nosed sturgeon both above the Turner's Dam and above Bellows Falls Dam, which has not been taken into consideration in any of the things that you mentioned, the studies that have been done. So what can DEP do? Can you ask for a biological opinion? I know that the ongoing study, it's going to be presented at a cooperative migratory fish meeting later this month, and I believe they're doing analysis of the habitat of the sturgeon and their breeding grounds above the dam. But as obviously the existence of Northfield could be extremely damaging to this fish that is endangered both under federal and Massachusetts law, what can you do to help protect these things? Do you have the power to shut down the facility until these things are, it's studied properly, or order more studies? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. Unfortunately, that's one of the questions that we can't answer right now because it's all under consideration. And we're aware of the DNA testing above the dam and aware of the presence of the short-nosed sturgeon below the dam. And I believe my colleague at Mass Wildlife will be speaking to that more when they speak. But in terms of what we can do as DEP, I can't comment on that right now because we are in the middle of the certification process.
Okay, great. Sonia, you have another one?
Yes, I do. Okay. So we have a question here from Alex Hoare. He's a retired regional hydropower coordinator, USFWS Massachusetts. Oh, okay. USFWS Massachusetts has the authority under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act to require screening of fish at the intakes of North Pump Storage. Is there any reason why you would not require that? And then there's a second piece.
Well, wait, can you read the question again?
Yes, I'll do my best. Okay, so generally the question is that Massachusetts has the authority under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act to require screening of fish at the intakes of North Pump Storage. The question is there any reason why you would not require that? So why you would not require screening of fish at the intakes of North Pump Storage, as I understand it?
Well, that is part of the water quality certification application. One of the terms of the settlement agreement was the inclusion of a barrier net in front of the intake structure to prevent the entrainment and the intake of fish into the intake structure. That was a term of the settlement agreement, and it's also a provision of the application, the certification application. So that is something that we are reviewing and considering.
Do we do it now? Okay, there's a second part of the question.
Yeah, and Sonia, I'll just ask, because that's
Yes.
less a process question. It's more a question to hold for the
Okay,
fish.
sorry, I'm being advised to share that one.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next piece is around erosion, so I will just hold
Yeah, you
that
can
until
hold
the
that.
erosion section.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. Stephanie, you have someone over there? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nina Gordon-Kirsch from the Connecticut River Conservancy, and you had mentioned the specific to plant species in the dewatered riverbed that you said are sensitive aquatic life, and I'm just curious how in the process you're orienting towards which species get authority over other species, considering the riverbed has been dewatered for so long, and there's a lot of aquatic life who can no longer live there. So like which species get authority in your process and how you make that decision?
Right. So as I mentioned before, existing uses, and particularly sensitive uses that were in existence after 1975, receive heightened protection. And it's difficult for me to answer the question without knowing more specifically what you're talking about in the context that you're talking about. But those sensitive plant species, one is endangered and one is threatened, require heightened protection under the water quality standards. That's our obligation, to protect those sensitive species.
Great. Thank you. Sonia.
Okay, we have a question from Jeffrey Gall. What is the definition of existing uses as of 1975 for the hydropower dam that exists? And there's a second part. What is the minimum bar for water quality standards of the river impoundment of the dam versus a free-flowing river? Do you want me to ask the first question again?
Yeah, please.
Okay, because I'm not holding it in my head. Okay, what is the definition of existing uses as of 1975 for a hydropower dam that exists?
It's the definition that I gave before, which is those designated uses and uses that are in existence after 1975, on or after 1975.
Okay. And the second part of the question is, what is the minimum bar for water quality standards of the river impoundment of the dam versus a free-flowing river?
I'm not sure I
understand the question either. Yeah.
Well, we can invite the person on Zoom to try and clarify
Yeah,
in
Jeffrey,
a
if you can
future-
clarify your
in a future
question, that
one.
would be helpful. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kira Christoph. I'm both from Montague and from Northfield. Thank you for taking the time to explain the structures that you're working within to try to express the greatest possible caring for this river. My question is there a meta process that allows us to engage with reform of the process if the process itself is not adequate to hold the fullness of what we're trying to do here today?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the middle part of your question.
I'm asking if there is a meta process for reforming the process for making these decisions if the structures that are in place have huge blind spots in them.
Yeah, well, the certification process is based upon the federal Clean Water Act. And Massachusetts, as required by the federal Clean Water Act, has enacted its own water quality standards. If you want to reform the state water quality standards, the best way to do that would be to advocate for that with your representatives, your senators. And if you want to reform the federal water quality standards, the Clean Water Act, obviously you would want to advocate with your federal representatives. I hope that answers your question.
Is it within the purview of what you are doing right now to be able to issue invitation to the public to engage in larger processes of reform?
That's not something that falls within our purview.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a lot more questions, but we want to move on to talk about erosion. We will take more questions as we go through the process, but we want to make sure that we have time to get through all of the presentations. I'm sorry. Everyone wants me to take his question? Okay, here you are.
Joe Gravelin, Senior Advisor for the Nolan Beaker Project Tribal Coalition, the Elnu Abenaki, and the Chalabunagungamog Band of Nipmuc Indians, Massachusetts, recognized. We've been stakeholders since 2012. Earlier in the presentation, you indicated it was out of your purview to consider our tribal issues. But I want to point out very clearly that I'm intimately familiar with the HIP guidelines and instructions, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, that were updated on March 21st, 2024, that say you have to take into consideration tribal knowledge, tribal experience, and tribal history. That hasn't happened. Under 36 CFR 800 Federal 106, which is the federal guidelines that are involved when any kind of license, money, federal actions are involved in a process, you have to bring in tribal people and find out what their concerns are. I sent Jesse a very detailed piece of documentation about our challenges with the bypass reach and the fact that it's dewatered, and the fact that our historical patrimony is often being stolen because the riverbed is dry, and there are an awful lot of historical and important processes that are existing there that tribal people would like to re-engage in. Another thing is we've had a shared deed with Fish and Wildlife for close to 20 years on the most significant historical site on the whole of the Connecticut River, the Wissatinniwag 10,000-year-old village. And nobody contacted us before they signed on to the Flows and Fish Agreement to find out what our concerns were and whether or not there could be something to represent tribal concerns with the fish and flows. We sent in adequate information with a lot of pictures saying we needed at least 2,000 cubic feet per minute to go down, per second, to go down through that to cover the cultural resources that are being stolen by the general public when they're out on that dry riverbed. And we got nothing out of it. Now, I want to bring you up to speed on the fact that since May 5th, FirstLight has a signed agreement, cultural resource settlement agreement in their possession that they have chosen not to sign. And you need to take that into consideration because we worked with them for a long time to try to get something together. And now they've got that in their possession, and they're telling FERC, and they're telling you guys that they're communicating with us and that they're working on it. They are not. They have that agreement, it's signed by us, and they haven't seen, and they haven't chosen to let you know about it, the public know about it, or even get back to us and sign the damn thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Thank you all. I don't know if there was a question there was there anything there, Tim, that you can respond to?
So are you going to take consideration for Federal 106 and the HIP guidelines in your process? You said you weren't early on. And I don't understand why not, because the federal law says if you want to get any kind of license.
Yep.
Yep. Mr. Gravelon, thank you for the question and the comments. Under our water quality standards, as they're presently written, we cannot consider the interests that I mentioned earlier. I'd be interested in reviewing the materials that you were discussing earlier, but I am not aware of those. I am aware that under our state water quality standards, we cannot consider those interests. Under the federal standards, yes. In fact, I think there's an obligation to do that in the FERC process.
So I need to. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to move on right now to hear about erosion. So if I can invite David, you can go from there or up here as you prefer.
Stacy. So I am here representing the Wetlands Program at MassDEP. The Wetlands Program administers and oversees the Wetlands Protection Act, as well as the 401 water quality certifications and other initiatives. We have one other program that's assisting our review of the water quality certification application. That's the Watershed Planning Program. They are not here tonight, but their expertise is the surface water quality standards. As Tim has mentioned, we are 6 months into a year-long process. We have not made any decisions yet. We are here standing in front of you to provide information and some transparency, but we're also listening. So if you have information, if you think I characterized something incorrectly, we would like to hear that. So we workshopped this agenda tonight to try to be as helpful as possible. My first agenda item, I will talk about what is erosion, what happens when there is substantial erosion, what kind of impacts occur, where our jurisdiction is as we review the water quality certification, and then ultimately who causes erosion or what are the forces that cause erosion. I will then go over what FirstLight has proposed to address the erosion. From there, I'll move to how we're reviewing it, and I'll provide as much transparency as I can at this point. And then I'll summarize some of the comments that we have heard from you and that you've taken advantage of our expanded public process. Okay. So erosion has been a problem in the impoundment. What is erosion? Erosion is the movement of soil, rock, vegetation, and other materials downstream. It can be natural, it can be normal, it can be needed for the ecosystem, but there can also be anthropogenic forces that contribute to it. And if substantial, it can impact plants, animals, and recreational uses of the river. What MassDEP is only allowed to look at is the FirstLight responsible erosion. So that's the operations of the dam facility and the pumping station. As such, MassDEP has to assess the causes of erosion. However, determining erosion causation is complex. It's very difficult. The 4 bullets I have here are paraphrased from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers report that was developed in 1979. Erosion variables are numerous and they can act individually or collectively. They're difficult to tease apart. So forces that cause erosion and the bank material that ultimately erodes is affected by the size and the gradation and the material of that bank material, where erosion occurs on the river system or the water body, such as the pools, the bends, or the straight reaches. All of that influences erosion. And then ultimately the forces that act on the riverbanks, such as the boat-generated waves, the freezing and the thawing, the vegetation or the lack thereof, as well as operations of hydropower systems. Even though studying erosion is complex, it has been studied extensively on the Connecticut River, and specifically the Turner Falls impoundment. Erosion analysis goes back decades. My next slide, I'll talk about several of these reports that started in the 70s. But some of those reports even looked back further. The percent and the location of the hydropower attributed erosion continues to be disputed. However, we're considering all the information, so not just the water quality cert application, but the whole field of literature and analysis is what we're looking at. So I've already mentioned the Corps, so U.S. Army Corps of Engineers report in 1979. There was a follow-up report there in 1991, and a number of other studies that have come since. So some of these papers and reports and analysis focus on erosion rates. Some of them focus on, is the river currently eroded? And some of them focus on causation. Many of these reports and findings have been disputed. So that's either methodology or the results or the interpretation of the results. It kind of goes back and forth in this 50-year-long conversation. My next few slides, I'll focus on the 3 most recent studies. They're at the bottom. I'll talk on the bank stability and toe erosion models, as well as the 2 peer reviews. So FirstLight's erosion analysis relied on a B-STEM model with field data. B-STEM, the bank stability and toe erosion model, is basically a computer model. It includes hydrologic inputs as well as field data. My figure on the right here was an extract from one of the first B-STEM reports. It shows some of those field data and transects that were used inside the model. The results. So again, results, when we're talking about erosion, that could mean multiple different things. There's multiple different sites, so 25 different sites. You could get an erosion rate. You could extrapolate that to a bank segment. You could also figure out, is there active erosion? Look at the bank. Is it eroding? And then also causation, which is something we're specifically talking about here tonight. So the first of the B-STEM reports was developed in 2016. It looked at the Northfield mountain operations under the existing license. So that's not the proposed license, but that's looking back the existing license. There were additional B-STEM reports and models that focused on causation for the water quality certification application. And so that's the proposed future river scenarios that's moving forward. There were several iterations because the burn and dam operations upstream of Northfield and Turner Falls has changed to run of river, is my understanding, as well as there were several negotiating changes in the fish and flow agreements. So those hydrologic inputs are in the most recent B-STEM analysis. So FirstLight's results, as reported by FirstLight, and this is the 2024 one that was submitted this spring. It's available online. Split up the causes of erosion into dominant causes and contributing causes. Obviously, the dominant causes contribute more than the contributing causes. The dominant causes of erosion, their findings were high flows and boat waves were the 2 main things. However, the operations contributed to erosion on 3 different sections of the river. That's 21,600 feet of erosion. So both river banks between Barton Cove and French King Gorge, and then 4,700 feet on river right upstream of the Northfield's tail race. And so that's looking downstream on the right-hand bank is river right. And I've got a figure here that shows those results. So the figure on the left, the 2 banks shown in brown, that is the 21,600 feet between Barton Cove and French King Gorge. The B-STEM results, as shown by FirstLight, those sections are affected by operations and have erosion affected by operations. The figure on the right shows the orange stream bank there. That is what I said, 4,600 feet of riverbank. That section too is affected by operations. So in response to the BSTEM analysis, there were 2 different peer reviews that are part of the record. Both of these documents are on the MassDEP website. The first that I'll go over was submitted on behalf of CRC, FERCOG, and Dr. Evan Dethier. The methodology for that assessment was a peer review of the BSTEM methodology and included a robust scientific literature review. The takeaways from the Dethier report were that the results, as reported by FirstLight, are underreported. So there's more erosion caused by operations than reported, and that the location of it was throughout the impoundment. The recommendations in the Dethier report included increased future monitoring, decreased operational fluctuation range, and further bank stabilization projects if the flow modification was unsuccessful. The second peer review that I'll talk about was conducted by Interfluve. Interfluve was MassDEP's consultant. They were scoped with determining if the BSTEM results demonstrated compliance with our surface water quality standards. The takeaways from the Interfluve report: the BSTEM simulations and the reports are an extensive body of work developed through a collaborative process and executed by competent professionals and experts. However, model results have limitations with respect to providing assurance that the proposed relicensed operations will be conducted in a manner that will not violate surface water quality standards. All right, we're switching gears here. Now I'm going to go over what was submitted as part of FirstLight's proposal. So this is in the water quality certification application. If MassDEP were to develop a water quality certification and condition that certification, this would be the starting point. So this is FirstLight's proposed stream bank erosion plan as part of their application. They proposed boat wake restrictions to address the boat erosion, and that would be worked out in coordination with MassDCR. Following the issuance of the water quality certification, FirstLight would develop a shoreline erosion monitoring plan to be approved by MassDEP. FirstLight would conduct a shoreline erosion survey. This is a continuation of the river reconnaissance analysis that they've done in the past. These would be conducted in year 1, year 10, year 20, year 30, and year 40. The reports would include a characterization of riverbank and erosion conditions and rely on cross-sections in part. The river reconnaissance would only include riverbank segments where BSTEM showed hydropower attributable erosion. So that would be the 3 sections that I previously identified. As part of the river reconnaissance, a summary report would identify locations that require stabilization, if any. And if stabilization or construction was recommended, then that would take place within 5 years, and as-built would accompany that. All right, switching gears again. MassDEP is reviewing the FirstLight's proposal in the water quality cert application. We've already told you that we can't tell you everything. We're still working through it. We're 6 months into a year-long process. The benefit of that for you is that we're still listening. So we have not made up our mind yet. But what I can share, if this is helpful, I like splitting it up into 2 different buckets. Existing erosion. For us to certify the project, we'd have to be assured that the existing hydropower attributable erosion would be addressed to attain compliance with the surface water quality standards. Future erosion. we would have to be assured that the future hydropower attributable erosion would be addressed to attain compliance with the surface water quality standards. As part of that process, there is an integrated list development conducted and issued by our watershed planning program. Those reports are developed every 2 to 4 to 6 years for every river and water body in the Commonwealth. As part of that assessment process, information is requested from the public, and that is before the report is developed, and then after the report is developed, that is put on public comment. And so that public process and engagement, we're committing to that throughout the term of the license as part of the Clean Water Act. Public comments received and reviewed. This is helpful, I think, to let everybody know what we've heard and let you know or assure you that we are hearing you or that maybe we haven't heard you. Comments were received from legislators, organizations, towns, engaged citizens. We've heard from the legislative delegation, cities and counties. We've heard from the tribes, utilities, organizations, nonprofits, and engaged citizens, stakeholders, and property owners. We thank everyone for submitting your comments and being engaged. Specific to erosion. If you go through our comments, all the comments are compiled and submitted on our website. If you go through those and pull out the erosion-related ones, there are certain themes and recommendations. One of them is minimize, limit river fluctuations, right? So that's the operations, water surface elevation going up and down. Reestablish riparian buffers. Continue the bank stabilization projects that were initiated under the 1999 Erosion Control Plan. Monitor for future erosion, and then make that data transparent. Almost all of that is related to future concerns. We did receive a couple comments about current state of the river, like X site is eroded, Y site needs to be repaired. But that was not received. We did not receive that overwhelmingly. So with that,
Great. All right. Thank you so much, David. So I have 2 requests for you. We're going to take comments or questions on erosion for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll take a break. So I have 2 requests because, as you see, there are lots of people both here and online who want to ask questions. So I ask, first, please be as concise as you can in the asking of your question. And the second is, please do try to focus on questions where you think you can actually learn new information from our panelists, because this is a really good opportunity to get this information, get your questions answered live. Okay, with that, John, if I can have you come up here. We have a number of questions. We'll start here, and then Sonia will come to you next.
Hello? Oh. Hi, my name is Kat Muffaletto. I live in Turners Falls. My first question is if that's not renewed, you noted that there were some questions about the current state, but if this is not renewed, is there going to be a responsibility from FirstLight to repair the damage that they've already done? So that's my first question. And then my second question is there was 2 peer reviews. The first one stating that things were being underreported, which to me sounds like this is some fraudulent activity. So will there be an opportunity for future peer reviews before the decision's made in the next few months?
Yeah, so the first question was the existing erosion, would that be addressed?
If the contract's not renewed, yes. Will there be a responsibility? I'm not sure if you can answer that, but I'm curious.
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
Okay.
We don't know the answer to that. You're suggesting if the license is not renewed.
Correct.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
Okay.
The second question was related to the 2 peer reviews.
Correct.
And would there be additional peer reviews? That's a good question, thank you. We are considering both of the existing peer reviews as part of the record, as well as all of the information that's ever been developed on the Connecticut River and the Turner Falls impoundment. We right now haven't committed to any additional peer reviews, but we have 6 months left, so I don't know. I think we're limited on time to get anything else. Yeah.
Thanks.
Good question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sonia, do you have one for us?
Yes, we've got a couple. Susan Wargatip, I'm sorry, I'm butchering your last name. Susan, your question. Who will be responsible for erosion repair and who would certify that the work is done appropriately? And just for those in Zoom land, we're prioritizing the erosion questions right now. So who will be responsible for erosion and who would certify that the work is done appropriately?
Yep. Yeah, thank you, Susan, for the question. It was who is responsible for the erosion repair and who would certify that it's done correctly. As part of the water quality certification, MassDEP would require the applicant, FirstLight, to be responsible for that repair. Who would certify that it is up to standards? Our watershed planning program, as I mentioned, develops these integrated lists. If you're unfamiliar with the integrated lists and that process, it can be found on our website. There's 2018, 2020, 2022 reports, and the Connecticut River isn't assessed during every single one of those, but ultimately that is where the impairments are listed. And that information is provided. And that's what I mentioned where the public comments can come into play. So ultimately, we would be on the hook for certifying and overseeing the FirstLight's responsibility to repair existing erosion.
And I would add too that, one of the things that FirstLight has proposed in their application and one of the things that we're considering too is future monitoring to help ensure that what is repaired stays in a stabilized state and does not deteriorate and does not erode in the future. And so that's one of the things that's under consideration too, the extent of a future monitoring plan to keep an eye on those sites, those troubled sites that have been eroding or are eroding or may erode in the future.
Great. Stephanie?
In the erosion presentation, here I am. In the erosion presentation, I heard the word compliance many times. Compliance, it sounds like you're going to allow something. The current license expired many years ago. If someone's driver's license expires and you keep driving, you're doing something quite illegal. So how can the state allow this so-called public utility, which is a private company, continue without a license going on for years and years?
I'm wondering if we can, do you have an erosion-related question?
This is an erosion of public trust.
Nice, nicely done. I'm gonna, if I can, hold that. Thank you for that comment. If there's a question instead, maybe we can have this gentleman.
Hello, I'm Carl Meyer from Greenfield, journalist, intervener, and member of the Fish and Aquatic Studies team for these relicensing hearings since 2012 with the FirstLight people over there and many of the people on the panel here. One of the things that I would like to have answered in this 12-year process, almost none of the agencies And no one has addressed the fact that the river flows backwards here in Franklin County. The river actually flows in reverse. And that has been tiptoed around and not mentioned in so many of the documents. And my first question way back in 2012 to John Howard was about a reverse river, but we didn't learn until 2016 from the schematics that when Northfield Mountain pumps at 15,000 cubic feet per second, a minimum, and this is about erosion, a minimum of 3 miles of river is reversed heading upstream. And that's only because that was, the schematic ends at 3 miles. And then when it spits water back out, the dead water back out through those turbines, it pushes water upstream towards Vermont and New Hampshire. So my question is, I don't want to go too long here, but we're supposed to, the Clean Water Act, Northfield Mountain came online in 1973. They flooded the plant. It didn't come online in 1972. The plant flooded, so it came online after the Clean Water Act. Now, the Clean Water Act talks about protecting the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of waterways, and Massachusetts should be aware of that. And yet, you've waited until after everybody has signed a comprehensive agreement to participate in the process here. And just to mention, your interfluve study was posted to FERC on June 20th, which was 15 days after FERC said they were ready for environmental analysis. So here's what it said. Interfluve's recommendations, even though they said the studies were very flawed and they weren't capturing much in their modeling and in situ stuff, Interfluve recognizes that the study period within the FERC integrated licensing process is past and that FERC has noticed the projects as ready for environmental analysis. So Interfluve is not recommending that modeling or other analysis be redone or revised. Why wasn't a water quality certificate investigated in this section of the river for these plants over the last 51 years is my one question. And the other questions involve the definitions under the CMR 401. Well, here's section 402. They talk about biological integrity, states there shall be no lethality. This river, everything that goes into Northfield, there is no expectation of survival. DEP Commonwealth rules references flowing water and harmonic mean flow. Well, when a river runs backward, how can that possibly be defined as a river? So my final question is, on an interstate basin, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, 20 miles, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, those are neighboring jurisdictions. How can you possibly define, what's your definition of the miles of river that flow backward? How would you characterize them? Or is there no standard here under these navigable waters of the United States, and they simply have no legal existence? Please characterize miles of river. What is that? Is there no protection in Massachusetts or whatever? I would like to know what a river that flows backward, what is that? What is that under surface water quality? Thank you.
Is there something?
Yeah, I picked up two questions. Why wasn't the initial license certified? I don't know. That was a long time ago.
Nobody sued you.
Maybe. The second question, how would we characterize the miles of river? So our watershed planning program splits up the Connecticut River, the Turner Falls impoundment, into different reaches. And then specific to erosion, they would assess how erosion affects the uses of the water, right? So there would be it would affect either the recreational use or the aquatic life use. And so what you're asking is how does the movement of the water backwards upstream affect aquatic life use?
And how do you
Yeah.
classify it as the DEP?
Right. So, I think they want to look at the data. So they want to look at the fish. They want to look at the habitat. They want to look at the turbidity in the water. It's all very data driven on how they make assessments and determine if the water is impaired. So the optics of that are not good. I recognize that, but the data has to support any impairments and removal of impairments.
Yeah, and I would follow up on two things. As David mentioned, the focus is on the aquatic life and how the aquatic life is doing relative to the river. And the studies show that, and our friends from Mass Wildlife can elaborate on this more, but the studies show that in terms of the effect of the backward flow of the river on the aquatic life, it seems to be doing fine. I know you may not like that answer, and the answer to the other question about certification is that it's my understanding when the license was first issued many years ago that a certification was not required.
Sonia, do we have one?
Yes, we do. We have a question from Miriam Defant. Does DEP have the authority to withhold recertification until existing erosion damage is repaired?
We cannot withhold certification. We have to issue a decision that either denies, allows, or waives certification by April 22nd, 2015. We cannot withhold.
Thank you.
Stephanie.
I have two questions. Firstly, I'd like you to either confirm or deny that there would be a circumstance in which a backwards flowing river would be considered acceptable here in Massachusetts.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
So I gather that there are situations, from what you've said, I gather that there are situations in which rivers reversing their course is permissible under our current regulations for clean water and erosion.
Again, the studies focus on the aquatic life, and we're considering the impacts on the aquatic life. That's something we're considering right now. And if there is a problem associated with the flow and impacts on aquatic life, that's something that we will take into consideration.
So yes, the river is allowed to flow backwards. There are conditions in which that would be permissible.
If the evidence shows that the aquatic life meets the standards, then that is sufficient under the water quality standards. And that's something, again, that we're studying.
Tim, is it fair to say, just trying to make sure this question is answered, he's asking, are you by law assessing the flow and direction? Is that part of what you are assessing? And what I hear you saying is we are assessing the impacts on aquatic life, not the direction of the flow. Is that correct?
To the extent that the direction of the flow has an impact on the aquatic life, yes, that's something that we can consider.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. My second question is, you mentioned continual supervision of erosion being a condition of the license. What would the possible repercussions be if the erosion standards were not met after the issuing of this license?
Well, if we ultimately have conditions And if we issue a certification with conditions that require monitoring going forward, and there are problems that arise, the certification would be enforceable, and we would be able to enforce those conditions to make sure that there's compliance with those conditions.
It would be enforceable by revocation?
I'm sorry, by what?
By a revoke of the license, or enforceable by what means?
It depends on the terms which have not yet been decided.
Okay, Sonia, do you have another one?
Hi there. We have the clarified question from Alex Hoare. So I'm going to try to summarize it. It says, bank erosion was an issue in the last relicensing. Conditions were not previously imposed by Massachusetts to resolve the issue. So getting to the question here, what alterations of operations are available to reduce stream bank erosion?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So the question was,
what alterations of operations are available to reduce stream bank erosion?
right, so our watershed planning program assesses erosion's impact on aquatic life use. As such, we are assessing how to minimize or prevent erosion versus mitigate afterwards. Part of that aquatic life use is the flows that Mass Wildlife will talk about. There is, as part of that agreement, there are Vernon Dam is run of river upstream, and then there is a 10% max requirement of uptake, as well as a requirement to have certain flows on the tail end of that. And so we're assessing the fish and flow agreement to see how we can balance that, the prevention of erosion versus the addressing of erosion.
Okay, so we have a lot more questions, and we want to give everybody a little bit of a break. Let's take 10 minutes, stretch your legs, use the restrooms, have some water or some snacks, come on back, and then we can move on with our agenda. Thank you. One of those, unfortunately for the people participating online, we are going to ask you to just put your questions in writing, and we're going to try to, DEP is going to try and respond to all of those in a written document that they will post on their website. We want to prioritize the live question and answer with the people in the room. So we're going to shift, because there are so many questions, and we do not want people to have to go home with their questions unanswered after coming out to this meeting. So to the extent we possibly can, we're going to shift to questions that people want to ask live. We do really ask you to be as concise as you can with your questions. We also ask, please, one question only per person. We know you have lots of questions. The other thing that we're going to shift is we have note cards here, and we have pencils. And if we aren't able to get to your question, we'll also be able to add those written questions to our compiled document that will come out after and be posted on the website. So if you have a question that you feel okay with just having answered in writing, please feel free to use these. And if, of course, we don't get to your question by the end of the night, for sure, please write your question down on these note cards and pencils. And Abby and others will be coming around if you would like a note card and a pencil. I do not want to take up any additional time away from turning this over to a presentation on fish and flows.
Can folks hear me? Okay, thanks. I tend to be soft-spoken, want to make sure. So again, my name is Jesse Leddick. I'm here from the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program at Mass Wildlife. I'm going to be giving the first half of this presentation talking about flows under the settlement agreement. And I'm going to be turning it over to my colleague Caleb, who's going to be talking about fish passage and entrainment. So for those of you who don't know, Mass Wildlife has statutory responsibility for conserving and managing the Commonwealth's fish and wildlife resources. In the case of FERC hydro relicensings, this means that we're involved in upstream and downstream fish passage, entrainment and impingement protection, and of course, improved flows. What you may not know is that Mass Wildlife also has statutory responsibility for protecting our most imperiled species, with an emphasis on species listed under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act and its regulations. So for this project, we're talking about 25 state and federally listed species, from sturgeon and freshwater mussels to insects and plants. And I've been doing this for a long time, and 25 listed species in one place is, well, it says a lot about both the current condition of the river and how important it is. And I actually kind of want to take a moment, step back, and just, I don't think we've said this enough, and maybe we should, just how much we appreciate you all being here and asking your questions. I think we're all here, and I know Caleb and I have been involved in this process for 14 years and counting. We're all here because we care about the river and we want to make it better. And I just want to acknowledge that and just appreciate everything that you guys are, that you're present. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about why we're here. And let's talk about the ecological impacts of dams really quick, just to level set everybody. Dams, as we all know or probably know, dramatically degrade river ecosystems. Now, a healthy river, there we go. A healthy river, a healthy large river, is going to provide habitat for a much greater number of native species, much more biodiversity than smaller rivers, and especially much more biodiversity than impounded rivers, which functionally and ecologically function more like lakes. Healthy large rivers are going to have few, if any, impoundments. They're going to have unimpeded access to necessary habitats, and they're going to have natural flows that change seasonally but are relatively consistent day to day. That's a really important point. And these are the conditions that our native species are adapted to. On the other hand, dams slow flows. They create these artificial impoundments that reduce biodiversity. They block fish and wildlife from migrating to necessary habitats, both by creating passage barriers, but also injuring or killing fish and wildlife that are attempting to migrate to the habitats they need. And they alter natural flows in ways that native species aren't adapted to. And I can't sort of emphasize that last point enough. It's really, really critical. And I didn't know this when I started 12 years ago on this project, but the Connecticut River is one of the most extensively dammed rivers in the US. There are 2 dams on the main stem in Massachusetts, but there's 14 on the main stem. 14, thank you. 14 on the main stem over its entire 400-mile length, and over 1,000 dams on its tributaries. So it's extensively dammed. So we've got our work cut out for us. And when you look at the main stem of the Connecticut River, 75%, fully 300 of the 400 miles of the Connecticut River are currently impounded by dams, which means they function more like lakes than they do like rivers. So this leaves 25%, or about 100 miles, that are free-flowing. And unfortunately, these free-flowing, these 25% free-flowing miles have been heavily degraded by flow alterations over decades. So the FERC process, I know Tim briefly gave an overview of this, so I'm going to go quickly. The FERC process offers one of the primary avenues for restoring and enhancing river ecology. And the Federal Power Act, which governs this process, requires that the project owner consult with state and federal fish and wildlife agencies during the relicensing process. And after a lengthy study request and review process that happened over the course of many years, Caleb and I authored many of those studies with our colleagues. FERC-approved studies were performed by the project owner. And those results are used to then guide development of any future license. As part of the process, agencies and the project owner, in this case FirstLight, submit proposed conditions to FERC, which then recommends final conditions that seek to balance power and non-power interests. So it's an important point here that under the FERC process, they seek to balance these competing interests, or what are some oftentimes competing interests. And of course, any party can participate and appeal in that process. So as I mentioned, we've been engaged in this FERC process for 12 years and counting. But we've also provided information and expertise to our federal and state partners to inform their related permitting processes. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, and MassDEP. So in this case, after completing the FERC-approved studies, FirstLight requested, engaged in a negotiated settlement agreement, where the intention was for all parties to agree to the recommended terms and conditions of the license before the agencies and FirstLight submitted these proposed terms and conditions to FERC. And this kicked off years of negotiations between FirstLight, Mass Wildlife, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and a number of NGOs. A question was asked earlier. I wanted to clarify that the Nature Conservancy was involved in all of those discussions, and they did sign the settlement agreement in the end. So I just wanted to lend some clarity to that. And it did result in a settlement agreement that were signed by nearly all participating parties. One thing I wanted to quickly highlight here is that these things are not always done in a vacuum. That's a good thing, right? And some of the terms and conditions that are recommended under the settlement agreement actually mirror those associated with a concurrent relicensing that's going on right now of the 3 dams immediately upstream on the Connecticut River: Wilder, Bellows Falls, and Vernon. So there's actually a lot of similarity between recommended terms and conditions because they actually seek to do a lot of the same things. All right. So I'm just going to give a quick overview, remind everybody again where we are and what we're talking about. So we've got here a close-up of the project. We've got the bottom part of the lower impoundment right here. Got the dam, Turner's Falls Dam. We have the power canal, which runs down here. Station 1, which is the smaller of the 2 power stations. Got Cabot Station here. And then we have what's called the bypass reach that runs 3.5 miles around the power canal. For study purposes, the bypass reach was divided into actually 3 sub-reaches. The first one receives almost all of its water from the dam. The second one, almost all of its water either from Reach 1 or Station 1. And then Reach 3 receives its water from Reach 2, but is also affected by the operations of Cabot Station. So a few, I would say, key points here just to kind of help frame some of Mass Wildlife's priorities here for conservation. So first, and we all know the impoundment is the river, right? But due to the dam, right now it functions more like a lake. And as I mentioned, lakes have less biodiversity value than large free-flowing rivers. So it's just important to acknowledge that right up front, that compared to the river, the free-flowing portions of the river, impounded portions really have much less value for biodiversity. Second, we all know this, the bypass reach is the historic path of the river. That's the river. And provides a really important high gradient rocky habitat for a lot of our native fish and wildlife. So as most of us know, this has been dewatered most of every year for decades, right? That's baseline conditions. So restoration of the bypass reach, these three reaches, and enhancing up and downstream fish passage at the dam, which Caleb's going to talk about, are two of Mass Wildlife's key conservation priorities and have been from the beginning. It's part of what drove our involvement here. But it's also important to remember that the bypass is only about 10%. 10% of the free-flowing river downstream of the project that's impacted by the project and its operations. So it's an important part, but it's a small part of a much larger picture. And there's an additional 25 miles or so downstream that are impacted by the dam, by the power stations, and how they operate. And these 25 plus free-flowing miles have been degraded by project operations for decades. So restoring natural flows here to these river miles are another one of our key priorities. And as you can see, this is reach 4 and reach 5, over 25 miles in total. All right, so let's dig in to the settlement. So first, we're going to provide an overview of how the settlement agreement will change flows below the dam, so within the bypass reach, and then we're going to scale up and talk about how flows are going to change below Cabot Station and those 25 miles of free-flowing river south of that. And then I'm going to pass it over to Caleb to talk a little bit more about fish passage. All right, so starting with flows in the bypass. So again, our goal here was to reintroduce higher seasonally appropriate minimum flows. And as a reminder, when we're talking about natural flows, what we would expect is that flows would be highest in the spring, they would come down in the summer and early fall, and then come back in the winter. That's what we would expect in a natural system. So unfortunately, we don't have time to go through a detailed sort of discussion of all the I would say, the gains of the settlement agreement, but I did want to highlight some of the key changes. So first, springtime. Throughout the bypass reach, minimum spring flows are increasing significantly. And this is, I would say, especially important in May and June, when river flows start to come down and you start to actually see water being shifted historically away from the river and into the power canal for power generation. So much higher flows in the springtime. During the summer, in reach 1, which as we saw before, is the northernmost reach of the bypass. It's about 3/4 of a mile in length. We're going to see minimum flows increase by a factor of about 4. And in the remaining 2.5 miles, reaches 2 and 3 of the bypass. So these are the areas below Station 1, all the way down to Cabot Station. Minimum summer flows are going to increase by a factor of between 12 and 15, depending on when in the season we're talking about. And we're going to see similar increases in the winter in both of these reaches. So really quickly, I've summarized sort of how some of the fish habitat is going to increase here compared to the current license. And I'm going to say right now, I'm not a fish guy. That's Caleb right here. I'm a community ecologist. I focus on a lot of our rare and endangered species, but they're all related. So Shad would see habitat increase by between 73 and 88%, depending on the life stage that we're talking about. Again, this is in the bypass reach. Habitat increases for short-nosed sturgeon are going to be even greater. They're going to be between 73 and 100%, again, depending on that life stage. And collectively, these changes are going to result in much more successful spawning of sturgeon and shad, and should really greatly improve access to the dam's current and future fish passage facilities. And it's not shown here because the study reports don't and can't really adequately quantify it. These changes are going to benefit the full suite of aquatic biodiversity, things that are really, really hard to measure, from freshwater mussels to native insects. And this is especially true for reaches 2 and 3, which are about 80% of the bypass reach, its total length. All right, so we're going to take a quick step back and talk about flow alterations. In my experience with dams, most people aren't thinking about flows and how alterations actually can be so damaging and what they do, but it's really, really critical. And so we need to start there by summarizing how the project and how the hydro facility is operated historically as a peaking facility. And peaking, you may have heard that term before. What it means is that historically the project has held back water when power prices are low, and then it releases power when power prices are high. That's what it does. It releases water in peaks or slugs of water. And as you might imagine, that results in huge fluctuations in flows and huge fluctuations in water surface elevations downstream, especially Cabot Station, which is the much bigger of the facilities. So this figure here is an example. Oh, let's go back. So this figure here is an example. Driven by data below Montague of how flows downstream of the project fluctuated on a day-to-day basis in midsummer of 2022. So this is actual data. Where flows increased from as little as 1,000 CFS down here to as much as 12,000 CFS. Day to day. And it's kind of hard to sort of picture what that means, but if you're actually standing in the river downstream, you're going to see water surface elevations going up and down by about 6 to 7 feet in a day. And actually those changes actually happen much more quickly than that. And these fluctuations result in a suite of impacts to our native biodiversity. Habitat inundation, and on the sort of the contrary to that, desiccation of habitats, displacement and stranding of fish and wildlife, decreased reproduction, growth, and survival, and collectively reduced biodiversity and resilience. There have been studies done that show that these peaked rivers, the biodiversity goes down. You end up losing all of your specialist species and you get all of these generalist species. So the number of total species actually goes down over time. So our goal is that. That's been our goal. To restore more natural flows that our native species are adapted to. So this is an example of what naturalized flows would likely have looked like during this same period. So this is sort of a depiction, if you will, of what we think the flows would have looked like during this time. It's an example. During the same period, as you can see, really importantly, day-to-day flows are pretty consistent, right? Day-to-day, the water surface elevations, the flows aren't changing very much, except when you see these peaks that are a result of rain events, right? That's what's going to drive water surface elevations and flows up. So our goal, naturalized flows, which improve habitat quantity, quality, and in particular persistence. Habitat persistence, that's a really key thing. Increased reproduction, survival, and growth, and overall increased biodiversity and resilience. There's a kind of a metaphor I've been thinking about for years now, trying to understand, like, how does this work? How does this actually affect our species? And what I came up with, it's an imperfect example, but imagine you're living and working out of a 3-bedroom house. And one day your landlord says, between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. every day, you can't use the bathroom. You can't use the kitchen. You can't use your bedrooms. You and your family have to only use the living room. That's essentially what's happening under peaking flows, where our species don't have access to the resources and the habitats that they need. And unlike us in this fictitious example, where we would be seeking a different place to live, our species can't do that. And this is essentially what we accomplished in the settlement agreement. Kind of flies under the radar a bit, in part because it's not well understood and not talked about enough. But we're really seeing a sea change towards these naturalized flows between April and November of every year. That's the key growing season. That's the key season when our native species are doing what they need to do to forage, to feed, to breed, to reproduce, and to prepare for the winter. And allowing for a limited number of hydropeaking events and hours each month. So it's highly constrained and constricted. And again, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but this same model is proposed also for the 3 dams immediately upstream of the facility. So we're talking about Vernon, Wilder, and Bellows Falls. And when you stitch those together, those 4 facilities together, and what we're hoping to accomplish here, you're talking about naturalized flows within about almost half of the free-flowing portion of the river. So about almost 50% of that 25% that's so important for biodiversity. We're on the verge of seeing those benefits. And then finally, the settlement. This also kind of flies under the radar here, but it also locked in higher minimum flows below Cabot Station as well. So not just the bypass reach, but below Cabot Station, which then translates to those higher minimum flows in those 25 miles downstream. So quickly to summarize here. So in the bypass reach, we're going to see moderate, I'm pointing to reach 1 here, moderate to significant, reaches 2 and 3, gains in minimum flows. And we're also getting those gains in minimum flows below Cabot Station and then the 25 miles downstream. And then we're also, again, seeing that shift toward naturalized flows, which closely mirror the natural hydrology that our native species are adapted to. So overall, we're poised on realizing really significant fish and wildlife benefits in close to 30 miles of free-flowing river habitat, which is, again, from our perspective, from a biodiversity perspective, is the most important and limited habitat for these species in the Connecticut River. And in Reach 1, again, those benefits are going to be more modest, and we're very aware of the interest in this issue. There we go. So we wanted to unpack this a little bit more and just sort of let folks know and give you guys a better understanding of why we landed where we did on Reach 1 specifically. So again, Reach 1, that's that northernmost reach of the bypass, directly below the dam. It's about just under 3/4 of a mile in length. And we really understand and appreciate the requests for higher minimum flows during the summer that folks have been requesting. And to take a step back and to kind of go back to the context that we provided earlier about the FERC process, it's really important to acknowledge here that FERC requires balancing of power and non-power interests. And we believe, and again, we've been working on this for years, that the outcome for Reach 1, which represents less than 3% of the total length of free-flowing river, we think that it finds an appropriate balance. I don't think there's a perfect solution here, but I think it finds an appropriate balance. So it does improve habitat for aquatic life, for outdoor recreation, for other things. Again, flows are increasing by a factor of 4, which is not insubstantial. On the other hand, it caps impacts to state-listed plant populations, which are found throughout the bypass reach, but it's capping the impacts in Reach 1. And that's an important point. I'm going to come back to it in a second. And it also caps loss of renewable power generation. Again, balancing of interest, power and non-power, and that's an important consideration and interest of FERC. So many of the requests have centered around flows of around 1,500 CFS or higher. So that's about 3 times what the settlement agreement has landed on. And I'd be the first to say that that increase, if we increase from 500 to 1,500, we're going to see benefits to some of our native fish and wildlife. We would see under that scenario, 500 to 1,500, you'd see an increase in wetted width of the river by about, it's actually less than 10%. So I want you to keep that in mind. A smaller than 10% increase in wetted width, benefiting, I would say, common native fish and wildlife species. I would also point out here that these same species that would benefit from that request are seeing huge benefits in the rest of the river, in reaches 2 and 3 in the bypass reach, where these minimum flows are increasing by a factor of 12 to 15 in the summertime, and in the 25 miles of river downstream of Cabot Station, where we're going to see this shift towards naturalized flows. That's going to benefit all the same species we're talking about here. On the other hand, if we were to do that, if we were to go from 500 to 1,500 CFS, we would lose greater than 95% of our state-listed rare plants that exist in the bypass reach. One of these species is actually an endemic species in New England. It's found nowhere else outside of New England, and this is our only population in Massachusetts. We have one population in Massachusetts. And it's important also to highlight here that under 500 CFS, which the settlement agreement dictates, we're going to see 40 to 60% loss of those species in Reach 1 alone. So and in Reaches 2 and 3, the impacts are actually going to be far greater, right? So the minimum flows in Reaches 2 and 3 here are 1,500 to 1,800 CFS. So we're expecting to see 95% loss or greater of these species down in these reaches. So again, we're talking about balance. And our goal, our seeking to find this balance, is to preserve a small portion of listed plants there. Down here, we're going to see close to full loss. And we're doing that because we want to see more water in the river. We want to see restoration of river ecology. And that's, again, what's been driving kind of our view of the bypass reach and why we landed where we did. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to
Thank you, Jesse.
I'm going to quickly run through the what's in the settlement agreement for fish passage. All right, so currently at the Turners Falls Dam, we have what I would say is an inadequate downstream passage protection. At Cabot Station, there's a full-depth trash rack, which is widely spaced and does not deter fish from being entrained. There's a 10-foot surface fish rack that was designed for Atlantic salmon smolts and juvenile shad that migrate near the surface. And there's a surface bypass at the end of that trash rack, which is actually seasonally installed into the ice and trash sluice. So there is not a good downstream passage that's there year round. Station 1 has only trash racks. There's really no fish exclusion there at all. And at the dam, currently there's no plunge pool. So especially when the flows are low in the summertime, fish going over the dam land on the rocks below rather than the water, which is not a good thing. At Northfield Mountain, we have been utilizing a fish net, but it was designed to protect Atlantic salmon and was installed seasonally. As far as upstream passage, there's a complex and underperforming system of fish ladders. The Cabot ladder down at the Cabot Station has been demonstrated to be very poor for shad passage. Heroic modifications over many years have only led to marginally increased success for passage there. The spillway fish ladder is limited in its usefulness due to the low flows below the dam later in the season. The fish just don't get up there to get into it. And the gatehouse ladder, this is a ladder inside the power canal where fish that get above the Cabot ladder into the power canal now have to get out of the power canal and into the impoundment. And that ladder was underperforming for many years. It underwent some major modifications a few years back, and it's working better, but it's still not ideal. And there is currently no upstream eel passage. So what's proposed in the settlement agreement is to replace the existing Cabot Station trash rack with a full-depth fish rack that'll have multiple openings for fish passage, and it was designed to better protect both juvenile and adult American shad and adult American eels. We're going to construct they're going to construct a fish exclusion rack at the entrance to Station 1 where Station 1 takes water out of the power canal. That's going to be a 3/4 inch rack, which should, as I said, exclude most fish from going into Station 1. It certainly was designed to keep adult American eels and adult downstream shad out of Station 1. And also going to construct a plunge pool downstream of the Turners Falls Dam Baskill Gate number 1 to provide water below that gate so that when fish go over the dam, they actually land in a pool rather than on the rocks. As far as upstream, the changes that are in the settlement agreement, they're going to retire the Cabot ladder that's never really worked very well for American shad. Replace the fish ladder up at the dam, the spillway ladder, with a fish lift. This should take advantage of increased flows in the springtime that are coming out of over the dam and out of Station 1 to allow fish to get up to the dam and use a fishway there that'll deposit them directly into the impoundment so they won't have to go through the power canal and go through 2 different fishways that way. And we're going to install upstream eel passage This is long overdue. We've been passing thousands of elvers down at Holyoke since they went through relicensing and built upstream eel ladders about 20 years ago. At Northfield Mountain, we're going to stay with the barrier net, which we actually found effective for Atlantic salmon smolts, although the new net will be designed to reduce the entrainment of resident fish, American shad, both adults and juvenile, and adult American eels. And built into the settlement agreement is a series of fish passage performance goals. Older licenses often just had targets for total number of fish that we wanted to pass, but that's dependent on many factors outside of the facility. You can have a really bad year for shad out in the ocean, and if none of them show up in the Connecticut River, you're not going to meet your fish passage goal if it's just a number. So these goals specify minimum percentage of fish that reach the dam that should successfully pass, and they also specify the maximum time that it should take these fish to pass. So it takes into account both a percentage of the fish and a time, because delay is also very important at these facilities. So just an example, for downstream passage for shad, adult shad, the goals are 95% of the fish, of the shad arriving within 1 kilometer of the Turners Falls Dam to survive downstream migration within 24 hours. And likewise for upstream passage for adult shad, 75% of the adult shad arriving within 500 meters below Cabot Station should successfully pass into the Turners Falls impoundment within 48 hours. That all sounds really good, but how do you know if it works? Well, also built into the settlement agreement is evaluation and adaptive management. All the new fish passage structures will be evaluated and tested against these performance goals. And when I mean evaluated, they're going to tag fish, release those fish, watch how, when, and where they go through the facilities, and then see if they meet the fish passage goals. If they fail to meet those goals, structures or operations can be changed, and you reevaluate and repeat. And this is just a couple tables out of the settlement agreement. We've already agreed on a number of the things that might not work and might need to be changed. So we're not going into this blind. There's a sort of an evaluation checklist. If the fish don't do what we think they were going to do, we already have a good idea of where we're going to go, what those first changes are going to be, and then to reevaluate fish passage after that. Is this Tim?
That's my turn.
Yeah, that's it for the fish passage. I'll be available afterwards for questions.
Thank you, Jesse and Caleb. Appreciate it. And as Caleb mentioned, there will be question and answer after I just go over these common public themes that we found when we were reviewing public comments and during the public hearings. The first one, as Jesse talked about, that the flow immediately below the dam should not be limited to 500 CFS. Jesse talked about the balance that they achieved in the settlement agreement, recognizing that increasing the flows to 500 CFS actually will jeopardize 40 to 60% of those sensitive plants. People commented that they want more robust monitoring of water quality, and I heard that from some of the comments in here, some of the questions that came. Thank you for raising those. Other comments related to preventing and addressing invasive plants. And that's something that we're looking into and considering pretty extensively right now. We're aware that there's a problem in Barton Cove area, downstream from Barton Cove area, and then upstream from Barton Cove a little bit. Other comments related to confining the impoundment water elevations to a narrower range and a specific monthly average of fluctuation. These comments are concerned that with the new license and new operations, that perhaps fluctuations will go outside of the current general range and they'll affect erosion and perhaps increase erosion. So that's something we're considering as well. Other comments focused on implementing fish passage conditions more expeditiously. It's true, the settlement agreement requires implementing of these fish passage conditions over a pretty lengthy period of time. They start, I think, with the first downstream passage not being operational, I think, until about year 5, maybe, after the license is issued. And there's some good reasons for taking so long. It's a very complex operation. And people ask, well, why can't you just install downstream and upstream passage at the same time? That's a very complex operation. You have to divert water to one place, install the new operations in one area, and you can't operate and install in both areas. But we're considering those comments as well, but it is problematic, as mentioned. Prevent or limit impacts from the expanded upper reservoir. That's something that we're considering as well and looking into. And then last, provide more real-time data for the public for dam and Northfield flows. And there's actually a provision in the, I think it's the Recreation Settlement Agreement that calls for more real-time data for flows and for the impoundment levels. So we appreciate the comments on that, and that's actually a part of the application too. So thank you for all those public comments, and there were many more, but these are just the general themes that we're representing tonight. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jesse, Caleb, Tim, for these. Okay, I want to reiterate for those who might have missed this when I said it right after the break, we are asking all of our Zoom participants to just have your questions written, and we will try to compile them and answer them in a written document afterward. We want to prioritize questions in the room. We want to remind you, one question, please. Try not to make it a long comment, just a question as much as you possibly can. And our team members have note cards and pencils, so please, if you would like to write down your questions, feel free to do that as well. So with that, and let's focus first on people who have not asked questions yet. So, yeah.
Yes, I'm Martha Jors, and I understand historically that the fish passed on or made the pass before the dams were put in on the opposite side of the bank. And I'm wondering if there has been or could there be any consideration of moving fish ladder or something to the other side of the bank at Turner's Falls, so that that genetic memory in the fish would be able to guide them a little bit better.
Is that a question you can answer?
Yeah, I'm not sure the fish remember which side of the river they were using, but certainly the water depth is important for fish to get upstream and downstream. And there are certain logistics of construction and land ownership. They can only, the project owner can only build a fishway on land that they own, and then there's water required to water those fishways. So it's constrained by a lot of engineering and things like that. But certainly we look at the river below the area where the fishway is going to be put in to make sure that there's depth and flow appropriate for the fish to get there. So I haven't heard this question before, but the fishway hasn't been designed yet, but the idea is it's going to be pretty much where the spillway fish ladder is now up at the dam for a lot of logistical reasons, as well as the biological reasons. There's deep water there, but I hope that answers your question.
Stephanie. Hey there. Thanks for being here and explaining all this to us tonight. So related to this relicensing process, has the DEP determined an amount of aquatic loss of life and habitat degradation that it considers acceptable? What is that amount, and what is the scientific basis for that determination?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm just curious. I'm sure there must be established thresholds that you use for what you consider acceptable aquatic loss of life and habitat degradation. So I was just hoping that, I'm not sure, maybe everybody here already knows, but I just wonder what those thresholds are and how you scientifically determine those thresholds. Because you would need the thresholds in order to know if the river is healthy and being used appropriately.
Right. Well, there's been many scientific studies done of the aquatic life as part of the FERC process, both below the dam and above the dam. And those scientific studies are based upon literature and other scientific studies, and we are reviewing those to determine the extent to which the aquatic life is impacted and the extent to which it can be improved through the certification.
Oh, I guess I'm just is it acceptable to kill 50% of the fish and fish life? What is the percentage of degradation? Because we're obviously accepting a certain amount of killing and environmental degradation. What is the amount that we as a society, as a democracy, have determined is the acceptable amount?
Are you referring specifically to the intake structure at Northfield Mountain?
Well, you're looking at this as whether to deny or approve this application. So the entire everything. Are you only looking at one single part? I'm talking about the holistic thing. What's the amount of death and degradation that is the acceptable threshold?
Caleb, you want to try to?
I believe as far as fish passage, we aim for 100% fish passage. We aim for 100% survival through the units. We know you can never get there, but that's what we aim for. We don't start negotiations by saying we're going to allow you to kill 50% of the fish. We start saying we want to protect 100%. I believe that what you're getting at is the water quality standards. If we're meeting Class B water quality standards, that's an acceptable amount of degradation as long as you meet those standards. But as far as specifically for fish go, we start at 100% and work our way back from there.
Okay. Did you have a question? Yeah. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Patty O'Neill, and a Greenfield resident. With climate change bringing some unexpected, maybe flooding, maybe intense drought, can you describe how this project would, does it have an emergency kind of ability to allow the river to flow freely if it needs to? If we have some kind of Like, I want to know more about, like, what are the emergency protocols, to deal with, like, what we're going to be facing. Thanks.
My understanding is that there's an agreement in place with the Army Corps of Engineers that requires the FirstLight facility, essentially, when the water levels and the flow reaches a certain amount, that they just have to let it go and they can't hold it back anymore, is my understanding.
And I could also add maybe something to that. It's a really good question. I guess from a flows perspective, I think it's important to keep in mind that with the shift towards naturalized flows, the idea is that what will largely be passed is what is being received by the project, right? So there's always going to be year-to-year fluctuations in what flows look like. Some years you're going to have drought years. Some years you're going to have very, very wet years. Many years there's going to be somewhere in between. We know those are going to change. The idea is that, again, the project is going to pass, again, what it receives. So it's going to allow those natural fluctuations to play out. Hope that helps.
How that accommodated such a drastic, sorry. Can you explain how that changed from the flow sequence before to the naturalized flow? What enables that process? That seems like a very drastic change, and how does that work?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer exactly like the mechanics of it. It is an important change. It is a big change, and what I would say there is that it's the direction that things are going, broadly speaking, in the U.S. There's this acknowledgement that peaking is highly detrimental to river ecosystems, and relicensings are realizing that and moving in that direction. How it's accomplished functionally, I think, is more of a question for the power company.
Well, I can add on to that, actually. Part of what's going to happen is you're going to see more naturalized flows from the Vernon Dam up in Vermont that are going to come down and reach the FirstLight facility. And then when they go through the impoundment at the FirstLight facility, I believe there's a provision in the settlement agreement now that requires FirstLight to pass 90% of that water that flows through. This is a generalization. And then they can take 10% of that and pump it up to the reservoir. So that's why you're going to see the dramatic improvement in naturalized flows if the settlement agreement is adopted by FERC below that Cabot station.
Thank you both so much, Caleb and Jesse. I thought there was a lot of heart, and it seems like you care about aquatic life. And of course, in one of your slides, Jesse, you showed the current licensing, and there is no current licensing. So I just wanted to ask you, in your heart of hearts, do you believe that those ideals will be met and monitored and enforced to meet your goals?
Thanks. It's a good question. I do. And the reason I say that is because there's so many levels of monitoring and compliance monitoring that are stacked on top of each other to make sure that happens. So you're talking about everything from federal law under the Federal Power Act all the way down to state law and everything in between. So I do.
I'm going to come over here.
Thank you. My name is Michael Klein. The Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection's mission reads that they're here to protect and enhance the Commonwealth's natural resources, air, water, and land, to provide for the health, safety, and welfare of all people, and to ensure a clean and safe environment for future generations. In carrying out this mission, MassDEP commits to address and advance environmental justice and equity for all people of the Commonwealth, provide meaningful, inclusive opportunities for people to participate in agency decisions that affect their lives, and ensure a diverse workforce that reflects the communities we serve. And my question is, don't you think it's the sovereign right and responsibility of residents of this valley to manage this river and to relieve this foreign entity? It's a function of the Canadian government to relieve them of this responsibility. They've proven over half a century that their approaches are harmful and destructive. And I think we're in a position now with the help of all of you, we're in a position here and have the responsibility to care for this river ourselves. Don't you think so? Can you answer that? Or is that under consideration as well?
It's a difficult, layered question to answer. Our obligation is expressed in the mission statement, but our obligation, as I explained at the beginning, is also to follow the water quality standards law. We're obligated to do that. And that's what we're trying to do in this certification process. I appreciate the question, but we have to follow our state laws and the federal laws as well in this process.
Even if you know that these laws are not adequate to protect air and water protection?
I don't know how to answer that question because I don't know that. I know that the laws were passed through processes that try to ensure they do what you're talking about, that make every effort to do that, and they're not perfect. No, they're not perfect, but we are obligated. We're a state of laws, we're a country of laws, and we have to follow those laws.
And you're satisfied with your...
So sorry, I need to stop you because we have lots of people who want to ask questions. Yes, please.
You did good.
Thank you. I live in Turners Falls. And Jesse, at the beginning of your statement, you said that we want to improve the river. The way I see it is the way to improve the river is to leave it alone. It'll improve itself. And the graph you had up of the daily fluctuations of the river in Reach 2 of the bypass were false. That's basically a puddle. That whole reach is a puddle. It is a puddle. You can walk across the riverbed. And it's been that way for a few years. You also implied that before, that has been basically dried out for the last, however many years. It hasn't been. 4 years ago, that river used to flow freely. It just got dried up like a few times a year for maybe a day or two. Now it hardly ever runs at all. So what I hear you saying, Jesse, is that to protect some plants that have now grown there because it is so dried out, including Reach number 1, the river has been so dried out on that bypass that it's given a chance for these plants to grow. So what I hear you saying is that you actually want to protect those plants and keep at a minimum how much water can actually flow through that bypass. Is that what I'm hearing you saying? You want to protect the plants by minimizing the flow through that bypass?
I think what we're saying is that in Reach, the northernmost portion of the bypass reach, that we're seeking balance between the competing interests. And limiting flows in the northern portion will still result in 40 to 60% loss. And again, probably near complete loss further downstream. But I would also highlight here that it's not just about rare plants, that there's multiple competing interests here. Rare plants are one of them, but it's not the only one.
Hey, thanks for being here tonight. Willie Crosby, resident of Montague. We're talking a lot about the importance of flows and the possibility of more naturalized flow in the river, particularly coming down from Vermont to the dam in Turner's. And just curious if you're considering at all, I haven't heard any mention of the flow around the Northfield pump station, and that has a negative flow. It's flowing upriver. So what's the impact on that stretch of river, and is there any conversation with FirstLight about flow in that section and the connection between Vermont flow and the flow between at Turner's Dam?
There's a lot of issues with flow in the impoundment above the dam, as Jesse pointed out. It acts more like a lake than a river because it's impounded. We realize that there's added issues with the intake to Northfield Mountain there, but as we were saying, the balance between what goes on in the impoundment and getting naturalized flows 25 miles of the river downstream is very important. You know, the net that we're talking about will keep hopefully fish from following that flow into the tail race and being entrained. We had a net there for a number of years for salmon. It worked really well. So I mean, you know, we're aware of the issues around the Northfield Mountain, but we do look for these changes towards more naturalized flow, starting in Vermont and going all the way to Connecticut now that all these facilities are being relicensed and looking at more naturalized flows.
Okay, I think we're going to take one last question. We're going to move to recreation, and then we're going to take all the rest of the questions that we can until we're kicked out at 10 o'clock. So let's take one more. Stephanie.
Thank you. Lynn Waldron from Greenfield. I really appreciate all the work that you're talking about with trying to improve fish flows up and downstream. So I'm understanding that there's how much of the river is still going to flow backward every day?
The operations of Northfield Mountain are not going to change significantly with this new license. So whatever's going on now is.
So how long, you know, I think I've heard that there's a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles of the river that actually flows backwards. There are people here that know that. And if that's happening every day for this length of the river, my heart breaks for you guys because you have worked so hard to figure out a way for these fish to survive and move up and down the river. And yet it's like Sisyphus and the mountain. No matter what you do, there's still going to be this river flowing backward that is going to disrupt that ecosystem and kill those fish. So I want to know if anyone's done a study about whether there's any real impact to our energy diversity if you deny that water quality permit and they don't do this anymore. Like, what has anyone studied what the impact of that is? Thank you.
Is there a study of no energy?
No, you're talking about if the plant was taken offline and what impact that would have on the Commonwealth's renewable energy grid and the grid itself, right?
I think she was asking about the impact on the ecosystem.
No, she just nodded yes. Yeah. That's a question that we can't consider as part of the certification process. It's not something we can consider. It's not official.
Okay, so we're going to move into our final topic, which is recreation and its connection to water quality.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Janegy. I'm director of the Massachusetts Office of Outdoor Recreation, and it is late, and you have been very patient, and I am very grateful that you are all still here and care so much about this project. I am here to talk about the recreation settlement, which I participated in for the Department of Conservation and Recreation over the period of the settlement process. Again, it's been mentioned, but the relicensing process goes back to 2012 with meetings, studies, and licensing filings, and I remember going to those first meetings. The Department of Conservation and Recreation doesn't have a statutory role here, but they are the state's agency charged with promoting both conservation and recreation. And so because of that, we participated in the settlement agreement discussions from 21 to 23. Along with National Park Service, a number of nonprofits, including American Whitewater, Appalachian Mountain Club, New England Flow, the 4 towns of Irving, Northfield, Montague, and Gill, Franklin Regional Council of Governments, and other nonprofit partners as well. We did reach recreation settlement that identified improvements to recreation that FirstLight would make in the project area, an estimated $6 million in recreational improvements, and those are on top of the recreational facilities that are part of the current license as well. In addition to that, the permanent conservation of certain FirstLight lands along the river. From a process point of view, the settlement agreement included 10 years reviews of the recreation management plan and guided by a recreational advisory committee. So let me just quickly go through some of the recreational improvements that are within that settlement. Starting up north in Northfield, improvements to creation of a pocket park at the Shell-Pawchog Bridge area. A new paddle-in campsite as part of the Connecticut River Paddlers Trail at Mallory Brook. Conservation of Bennett Meadow and a new hiking and interpretive trail there as well. Down at the Riverview area at Northfield, relocation of the current dock and installation of additional docks and also ADA improvements to that facility. I'm going to step off the river for a moment, even though I know I'm supposed to stick to water-related recreation. There are also non-water-related recreation improvements, including conservation of Farley Ledges, which is an important climbing area, part of which is on FirstLight's land. There will be permanent conservation of the section of the New England Trail that goes along FirstLight's land, an affirmation of Rose Ledges as a recreational area within the project area, and then an investment and creation of up to 5 miles of new mountain biking trail at the Northfield Mountain Recreation Area. Continuing downstream, there will be a new access point at Cabot Camp. And then, whoa, zooming in here, if I can. A new paddle-in canoe area at Barton Cove Campsite. A new put-in takeout at the top of Unity Park. This will now allow, currently if you're doing a through paddle of the Connecticut River, you have to call FirstLight or somebody else for a pickup and a vehicle portage from the Gill boat ramp all the way down to Poplar Street access here. This will allow for paddlers to take out here, portage their boats down to just below the dam where there will be an installation of a viewing platform and 2 different put-ins below the dam. Also an improvement to fishing access at Station 1, a new portage trail around what's called the Rock Dam down here that will again facilitate through paddling. some improvements to access at that area, Cabot Woods and the Rock Dam, and then an improved put in and take out at Poplar Street access site for boaters, which is a challenging site. In addition to all those recreational improvements, the settlement agreement also includes conservation restrictions to be put on a number of lands within the project area. These three maps don't show the full extent of all those lands, but are exemplary from the, dang it, I'm hitting the wrong button. I'm trying to hit the pointer button. There we go. From these lands down in the Turner's Falls area, and just upstream of that here, and then also in Northfield along the river. And this will allow for permanent conservation of these lands. And with that, I think I turn it to Tim to talk about the comments that have been received relative to recreation.
All right, thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. And here are your notes. Okay. Bless you. So, yeah, I wanted to follow up with Paul and summarize the public comments that we received during the written comment period and also the public hearings. And again, these are just general themes that we heard from all of you. And thanks again for your input. We're definitely paying attention to your input. So thank you. We appreciate it. Good water quality is important for recreation activities. People express concern of the lack of notice for the impoundment level changes and the effect that they have on recreation opportunities. And as I mentioned before, there actually is a provision in the recreation agreement that Paul was just talking about that would call for notice of the impoundment levels in real time. And also, I believe, predicting future impoundment levels on a 12-hour basis, I believe it is. There was concern that erosion would affect recreation opportunities. And that's something we're considering. Concern regarding recreation having a negative impact on short-nosed sturgeon spawning. This is the sort of trade-off that Jesse was talking about earlier with flows, and people want increased flows below the dam. And that would have impacts on other aquatic life, negative impacts on other aquatic life, notwithstanding the fact that the flows increasing to 500 CFS would have dramatic improvements on other aquatic life and increased boating as well, one of the designated uses. Flow directly below and adjacent to the dam is too low for boating. There actually was a study done on whether the proposed flows in the recreation agreement of 500 CFS would be adequate for boating under there, because boating is a designated use, as I was talking about before. And it was determined based upon that study that the flows of 500 CFS would be sufficient for navigating a boat in that area, which is, again, a designated use. And then last, 7 out of 9 comments on the recreation agreement supported it, noting also that 6 were signatories to the agreement. And that's it. I'll turn it over to Stacy now.
Great. Okay, so we're going to take a couple of minutes to talk specifically questions you have about the recreation and water quality presentation you heard. So just about recreation. Is this about recreation?
Addressing recreation, everybody signed a comprehensive agreement, including Department of Conservation, Recreation, Mass Fisheries, Endangered Species, National Marine. So they were all sort of thrown in at the last minute with fish passage. And so I wanted to address a couple things. First of all, there was a net. I guess I wanted to clarify for Caleb that the salmon net was often found failing on the Connecticut River, and people have noted that with new flows, it is likely to fail. We've had fishable shad going upstream past there since 1980, and we're going to have to wait 7 years to find out about this net, which is even Dr. Alex Harrow, who you know, says it's likely to biofoul, fail in high flows, and the 3/4-inch mesh is going to kill all sorts of young of the year fish, eggs, and larvae. But my bigger question is that you all signed a comprehensive agreement with FirstLight Power, which is owned by Canada's public sector pension investment, a global outfit. And here's what it says, where this is what you supported, 4.7, support for implementation. Upon notification by FirstLight of the need therefore, the other parties shall provide written communications or orally in the event written communication is impossible to obtain due to reasons outside a party's control, of support in any administrative approval process that may be required for implementation of the settlement agreement or related articles of the new project licenses, subject to available party resources and regulatory party authority policy. Why are we here? You've already promised. Did you register as a foreign lobbyist for a foreign corporation? You've already promised this. You're not. This is done. This is done. Why are we even here?
Maybe, Tim, you can explain the DEP's still considering the...
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question. I wasn't party to those settlement agreements, but we're here for the certification process, and DEP is taking an independent view of compliance with the water quality standards and whether the licensed operations will comply with those water quality standards.
So I'd like to see if there are any recreation-related questions, and then we will move on to any other questions that people want to ask. But we want to just make sure if anyone does have questions about recreation, they have a chance to ask them. Thanks.
My name is Greta Motz-Birkby, and my question is that on the Quabbin, they don't allow any kind of motorboats. Actually, they're very restricted because obviously Quabbin is drinking water. And I'm wondering, I didn't hear anything about restricting motorboats, especially since FirstLight itself seems to think that the number one problem is the wake from boats. And so have you, is there anything in the settlement about restricting motorboats? And I sort of have a follow-up. Are you at all concerned about any kind of invasive species coming in on boats? Or are you asking that the boats be washed down so that there isn't any kind of invasive species?
So speaking in terms of the recreation settlement agreement, the recreation settlement agreement is about FirstLight's responsibility for recreational improvements and enhancements. They don't actually control the uses of the river, and motorboating is a use of the river. And just not speaking I'll speak as from my position as director of the Office of Outdoor Recreation. Motorboating is an important recreational use on the river. So to answer your question specifically, there was nothing in the settlement agreement that specifically restricted motorboating on the river. There was discussion, I believe, maybe not in the settlement agreement, but both about control of invasive species and making sure that we try to limit or prevent invasive species from coming in on things like boats, and also on potential speed regulations.
All right, thank you. We have one more recreation question. Okay, so what I'd like to do, because it's 9:22 and we have till 10 o'clock before we have to leave, is maybe invite you, Tim, to just give a minute or two on next steps. allow folks who might want to go to do so, invite those who are in back to kind of come on down. We are still gonna, and then we'll take questions about any of the topics. I will request again, questions that you really want to get answered from this panel should be the priority if you can.
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, in terms of next steps, I touched on these briefly before, but I'll go over them again. So this is the timeline. We started on February 22nd, 2024. That's when the application was filed, and the endpoint, as you can see, is April 22nd, 2025. We're here on October 10th, the information session, and then in December and January or early January 2025 is when we intend to issue a decision, followed by a written comment period, and followed by 2 public hearings, one in the afternoon, one in the evening, as we did at the beginning of the process on the application. And that'll be in January, early February probably, and then April 22nd we'll issue the decision. And we look forward to receiving your comments, written comments, and at the public hearing. They've been important to us in this process. We considered them extensively and reviewed them extensively, and they mean a lot to us. They influence us. So keep them coming, and we look forward to your public comments, both in the hearing and the written comment period in the future on a draft decision. Thank you.
Great. Okay. What we're going to do is, here's the website again for those who want that. We're going to start with people who have not yet asked questions, and then if there are people who want to ask their second question, we'll come back around to you. So where's my...
This person, I was about to ask.
You're going to go over here? Okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear us?
Nope. No. Got to turn it on.
Stop. Is that better?
Yeah.
Caleb, Jesse, thank you as always for the thoughtful presentations. My question refers back to the independent authority, and it is directed at DEP. The question of the timing of the fish passage improvements. It is clear that there are actually 2 considerations in that, both technical complexity and also finances. So there is information in the record that demonstrates that there is a feasibility for the deployment of those structures at a time frame that is much quicker in the settlement. So the question for DEP, do you envision taking a peer review of the technical feasibility of deploying the fish passage structures at a quicker time frame? And again, Andy Fisk, American Rivers.
Thank you for the question. And the question is whether we are planning to undertake a technical review of the feasibility of implementing the fish timing.
Independent review of the current testimony that says you can do it quicker.
Yeah, that is unfortunately one of the things I can't comment on right now. Unfortunately, we're in the middle of the certification process, and it's something that is under consideration. Everything's on the table right now, but I can't comment on that right now.
Bring that up, there was the question about an additional peer review, and you were able to answer that it wasn't possible to the time frame. So it's really not what you decide, but whether you would actually undertake a peer review of the technical feasibility at the time. Not what you would conclude, but whether you would.
Yeah.
I can't hear your question, sir.
So I'm not asking you what you would determine, but whether you would undertake a peer review of what is currently in the record to evaluate the technical basis of implementing the fish passage structures on a quicker time frame. Not what you would conclude, But would you do a peer review of that? Previously, you were asked about undertaking an additional peer review, and your answer was, well, we really don't have time. Right. So you were able to comment on that. So just curious if you can comment on this peer review request. Thank you.
Right. Again, it's something that is under consideration, and I can't comment on it right now. My thinking, frankly, is there probably is not enough time, similar to an additional peer review on erosion, which was discussed previously.
Yep, Stephanie.
Hi, Frank
Wait,
Ribeiro.
sorry, we're going to just trade off mics. You can come next. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, my name is Emma Aaron. I live in Florence. And when I was listening to Jesse and Caleb, I also, like someone else said, I really believed that you care about the wildlife in the rivers. And I'm trying to understand, and I can see that you worked really hard on this settlement agreement. And I'm wondering about, do you want, and I also heard at the beginning Tim saying that if the settlement agreement doesn't go through, then it's going to go to court and you don't know what will happen. And I guess I'm just wondering if, wouldn't the best outcome for the wildlife in the river be just that this facility is not operational? And I'm wondering, do you think that the settlement agreement is the best that you can actually get? Is that why that's what you're going for? And why? What would be the reason to believe that that you couldn't have better than that?
Yeah.
Well, based on having done this a few times, we do believe that the settlement agreement is the best that we can get, because if we go to FERC and let them choose terms and conditions for the operation of the hydro plant, they tend to lean towards hydropower. It's right in their name. The Federal Power Act says they have to balance fish and wildlife and power, but you don't know what they're going to do. That's the problem with laying it all on FERC. When you do a settlement agreement, you know what you're getting up front. You go in, you negotiate, you get your best deal. Everybody knows what's coming out the other end. I can't answer your question about whether it would be better not to have project there. That's not what we were asked. I can tell you if there's no project, no one's going to be paying for the new fish passage stuff, and the dam will still be there, so I could see that might be problematic, but that wasn't the question we were asked. We were said, given what we got, how do you get what's best for the fish? And we believe that's a negotiated settlement rather than just letting some staff member at FERC decide, down in Washington, D.C., what's best for the Connecticut River.
Thanks. Sir.
Or if I could, I actually wanted to just
sorry, go ahead, Jesse.
make one quick comment. It's a really good question that you're asking, and I just wanted to, I guess, maybe give an example of a contrast. So I know there was a question about invasive species and whether there was concern around invasive species. And we explored whether addressing invasive species issues could be incorporated into the settlement agreement. And we, as Mass Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, agreed that we couldn't reach agreement on those issues. And so it was not incorporated into the settlement agreement. And we're going through the FERC process to see if we can do better. So we wouldn't have, I think, engaged in this and signed onto the settlement agreement if we didn't think that this was really a really good outcome.
Okay, I'm going to try again. Frank Ribeiro, Berniston, Massachusetts. And one thing that I appreciate what you guys said, and I love the idea of getting the river in a natural flow basis. Okay, how soon after the license is renewed would this happen? And I have a follow-up, but I'll just ask it right now. I find it hard to understand how you will be able to get normal flows if the Northfield monster continues. And that to me is I don't see how, if they're doing this up and down, whenever they want to, how do you control the natural flow? You didn't, it didn't seem like you explained that, to me anyway.
Thank you.
So the first question is how quickly would these flow changes be made? And I don't have the settlement agreement in front of me, but my memory, if it serves me correctly, is that it would depend on the nature of the flow change. So a lot of the minimum flow changes in the bypass reach would happen immediately. So upon the license being issued, you would see those minimum flow changes happen right away. The changes towards this naturalized flow regime that we're talking about, which would largely be happening through operation of Cabot Station and managing the impoundment, I think there's a period of 3 years where they have to start working towards that, but we're giving them a small window of time to fine tune it and to make sure that they can actually meet the requirements that are laid out.
So by doing this, this will automatically change the way they operate Montague? No. Yeah.
In terms of minimum flows, that would.
Cabot versus Northfield is what you're saying.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
And then they're dumping. I mean, they're going to have to do it less in order to maintain the natural flow, right? If they're pouring, they're dumping it down. All of a sudden, you've got this big surge. That's not natural. I mean, so, or they're drawing it out, and so, well, there's less in the water. That's not natural. So how that storage thing isn't meant, you're not restricting its activity. How are you getting a natural flow? I still don't understand that. And you're not answering that question. I don't see.
Right. Well, it's a good question, and it's hard for me to answer because I'm not a manager of a dam and a facility. But
Can you answer? Anybody answer? Because I think that's that.
yeah, so I'll attempt to, and then I can turn it over to. Yeah. So they're related but different. So when we're talking about naturalized flows, we're talking about naturalized flows below the dam, and in particular below Cabot Station, right? So Cabot Station is the large hydropower units, which of the station's capacity, I think it's like 90 or 95% of what.
What about Vermont? You mentioned that in your
Yep.
conversation.
Yep.
So isn't that part of the whole natural flow process?
Mm-hmm.
And I see this little monster in the middle sort of gets in the way of that flow.
Right.
I mean, come on, huh?
Yeah.
I don't understand how it isn't.
Yeah. Well,
That's the issue. So you're saying that after all is said and done, that once it gets beyond the dam, gets down to Cabot, that's where everything gets normal. But nothing's normal from Vermont down. That's what it sounds like to me. And that's really my issue or our issue to a great degree. It may not be yours because it's only so many miles or some percentage. You're worried about the 25 miles below. I think we're looking at whatever miles above or, beyond, north of Northfield and to the impoundment area as it's for. So, really? I mean, am I hitting it on the head or not?
Sir, my understanding is that what FERC is doing in this relicensing process is that they're coordinating, I think Jesse may have mentioned this earlier, or maybe David did, they're coordinating the relicensing of these dams, Vernon, as well as Turner's Falls Dam, and there will be more even flow coming from Vernon, is my understanding. And so with that, you will have increased flow coming down to the Turner's Falls Dam as well.
But you're not moderating storage.
So, sorry, it's been a number of complex questions, and I want to make sure that everyone.
No, I'm not able to answer
Sir, sir, I think I can help answer the question. My understanding is that under the flows settlement agreement that they were speaking to, is there's a limitation on the amount of water that the Northfield intake structure can uptake to 10% of the naturally routed flow that comes down to the dam. That's the limitation. 20% under some circumstances. The remaining 90 to 80% has to flow down the rest of the river. And that's why you get a more naturalized, equalized flow.
All right, thank you. We're going to take one more here, and then we are going to read some of the written questions that were written here in the room as well.
My name is Priscilla Lynch. I'm from Conway. And I've heard you all speak about the Clean Water Act several times. So we all acknowledge that this is a law still now. And I'm aware that one of the main initiatives of that law is to regulate discharges into our waterways. And yet tonight, right in the very beginning, you admitted you don't monitor discharge at all from these facilities. How are we to be trusting you to be really making good assessments and decisions about what's happening with our river if you're not even monitoring the discharge required by the Clean Water Act? And also, I understand, and we understand, that there was a DEP requested a meeting with FirstLight before this process all began, or at least before the public process all began. And we know that FirstLight has required a great deal of secrecy and inability for people who have made agreements, people who didn't make agreements, to communicate with each other and communicate with us, the public. Please be transparent and tell us why you met with FirstLight and wanted to meet with FirstLight before you met with your constituents here, the people that you represent. And please tell us what was discussed in that meeting, why that meeting was held, and what the outcome of that meeting was. Thank you.
I think you might be referring to the pre-meeting that we held. That is required by the Federal Power Act, I believe it is, or maybe Section 401, I'm not sure what it is, but it is a meeting that is required between the applicant and the regulatory agency. And it's not uncommon for an applicant and a regulatory agency to meet. In fact, it's quite common. That is how terms of a license, a permit, a condition, other things are worked out between the applicant and the agency. We also take into account, as I said, the many public comments that have been considered. And for this particular matter, because it's so important to everyone, and we understand it, it's important to us, we've expanded our public process to engage more and hear more from the public.
Thank you.
I don't believe it's required.
What's required, sir?
I don't believe that
The pre-meeting, he's asking.
the power company can request it, but it is not a requirement in this process.
You may be correct, sir, but again, I'm not certain about the answer, but again, part of a regulatory process involves the regulatory agency meeting with an applicant, meeting with somebody who's applying for a permit, and working through the process. There's a process that's involved. It doesn't just happen in this matter. It happens in the Wetlands Protection Act, it happens in the Clean Air Act, it happens in all of these regulatory permitting schemes.
Thank you. So, Sonia, can I, do you have a question that you want to read?
The question is what that meeting entailed, what it was about, did you make any agreements with them, etc.?
That was a meeting between us and the applicant about how things would play out and how we would schedule things and what we would require, what we were looking for in the application, things of that nature.
Thank you. Sonia, sorry, I'm gonna let some other questions be asked. Sonia?
Okay. So there's this question. Does the process allow for DEP to increase local oversight of erosion monitoring and restoration work? And this is from Franklin Regional Council of Governments and the Conservation Commission.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure, sorry. Does the process allow for DEP to increase local oversight of erosion monitoring and restoration work?
By local oversight, meaning local input?
I think, yes, to increase local oversight of erosion monitoring. Does the process allow for DEP to increase local oversight of erosion monitoring and restoration work?
Okay, I understand the question to mean, can we, as part of the certification process, involve local input? Well, that's what we're doing now. We're involving local input now through public comment.
I think it's about, I'm going to take my best guess here, but I think this is about, as part of the conditions moving forward, can DEP increase local oversight of erosion monitoring?
Okay, I understand the question. I understand.
Yes.
Right. That is something I believe we could consider and something that is under consideration. Yes.
Thanks. Do we have Stephanie, you want to offer someone who hasn't gotten a chance to ask a question yet?
Could you talk about the timeline for installing some kind of netting on the intake at Northfield? I understand that a fish ladder must be a pretty complicated endeavor, but it seems like that would be quite simple. And has a timeline been agreed upon?
Nothing's agreed upon. I mean, there are outlines in the settlement agreement for timelines for all the fish passage things. So yeah, there's a tentative timeline. I don't have it in front of me. I know it's several years into the. Yeah, no. There's a priority list of items for fish passage. There's a lot of stuff going on. We're starting with downstream passage. There's work at Cabot. There's work with the plunge pool. It's just the way it was all planned out. That's where it ended up. But I mean, it's not like we're not doing anything. There's a whole lot of different construction going on in different places around the project, and it's just the way the schedule has worked out. It would be beautiful if we could do it all at once, but.
Hi. I kind of had a question about how you're thinking about the trade-offs. You said like a few times that you're trying for the best, but maybe you can't quite get the best. Like you love 100% of the fish to live, but maybe you can't get that. Maybe like I saw there, like 75%, right, was in the standards. So I was just trying to understand like your role here. Like you can deny this application. Like could you just say, hey, we need 100% of fish to survive, and if not, we're just going to deny your application? Or what's pushing back on that? Why can't, I mean, who's telling you that you can't just require that? I mean, you didn't sign on to these settlements, right? So you could add additional things as well so I'm just trying to understand like what the scope is of your actual power here and what would be limiting to that power if you did find that, approving it would have certain detriments.
That's a question for DEP. As Fish and Wildlife, we were involved with the FERC process, try to get, the best fish passage that we could. But if you're talking about denial of the water quality certification, that's out of my purview. That's DEP.
So you just advise DEP, and then DEP is the one who decides. And so from DEP's perspective, if they advise you we want higher standards, why wouldn't you just say yes?
They don't advise us. We're considering the settlement agreement that they entered. And yes, we could deny it. We could waive it. We could grant it. We could grant it with with conditions. But part of that decision-making is sort of what these guys were talking about before, sort of trying to predict the future. If we just flat out deny it, then it goes into litigation, probably, starting in the state courts, then it goes into the federal courts, and with an uncertain, unpredictable outcome that goes on for years and years and years. So we have to consider that as well, this possible risky, unforeseeable future compared to what we could possibly do if we maybe issued a certification with conditions that we knew FERC would have to incorporate into the license.
And if the certifications are too high, are you worried that they'd be litigated? Is that why?
That is part of the concern too. If we issue a certification with conditions, that can be litigated too and challenged in court. So we're trying to decide what is the optimal decision to achieve here. It's a very complex decision, very complex decision. If we issue a decision with conditions and the applicant is unhappy with that, FirstLight's unhappy with that, chances are they'll appeal it, it'll start in the state courts, then it'll go up to the federal courts, most likely. I'm not sure of that, but most likely, again, with an uncertain outcome many years into the future.
And can I just highlight one point about that?
Sure.
It's likely that all that time, the power plants would be operating under the existing license.
That's correct. The existing license would probably continue.
It gets
renewed. It gets renewed year after year until there's a new license.
So,
Not by us, by FERC.
Sonia, do you want to read us another one? We have about 10 minutes, and then we're going to try and take as many questions as we can in that time.
I'd like to bring some clarity.
Hang on. We're gonna let Sonia read a question.
Okay. Well, there is this question. Can FERC move forward with the license approval if DEP denies certification? But it sounds like what you're saying is if DEP were to deny, it would go to court for many
That's
many
correct.
years.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay. So, and during that time, the current state
The
of
current
affairs
license, the current license and the current state of affairs would continue.
indefinitely until resolved and a new license comes.
That's my understanding.
Stephanie, we're going to let Stephanie do a question.
Hello, Gary Selden, Greenfield. I'd like to believe you, each of you, that you love the environment. You've devoted your lives to it. I'm going to try and contain my anger. I don't want to be angry at you. I want to encourage you to deny the certificate for the Northfield project because it's a desecration of the river. What I would encourage you to do is to use your knowledge and your efforts to find the laws that can move in that direction. Oh, I just want to stamp my foot. This feels to me like an emperor has no clothes situation because the plain, blatant truth of the river running backwards in all of the fish that go through those grinders, the turbines, death to them. It's desecration. It's horrible. And I speak with this emotion. I also have rational ability. And I want to encourage you to use your hearts and your rational ability to push harder. I hear you speak of how it would be for you looking down at Washington. Well, damn it, that's how I feel looking at you. And I want you to do the work for us. I want my Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection to protect the environment for me and for us. I am sorry to express this with the anger attached, but that how it is. And I do not have a question. I have asked you what I want you to do. I'm done.
Are there people who have questions still? We want to just take any final questions who haven't gotten a chance to speak yet. Stephanie, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Donna Riggs. I'm Greenfield resident.
pretty new, so I was really curious here. I've learned a lot, but I want to go back to, in the beginning, didn't you say that the settlement was pretty much the focus where you're kind of leaning towards, and kind of sounded like unless there was a really significant thing, it was pretty much the settlement? Is that what I understood? Is that the interpretation correct?
No, what I was saying is that there's a very, very, very high likelihood that the settlement agreement will be incorporated into the FERC license, because it is a settlement agreement and FERC looks with favor on those. And then secondly, because it was essentially adopted into the comments, recommendations, and prescriptions by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, and Mass Wildlife. And so because of that, you have an extremely high likelihood that the settlement agreement terms will be incorporated into the license, yes.
So I guess what I'm thinking from that is, what would it take? Because I've heard a lot of significant issues brought up. What would it take for you to not, or to deny it? It sounds like basically, I don't know if you've ever denied a certification, but it sounds like the denial because of the liability for court cases is just probably not an option, which means then there's waivers and then there's approvals which get negotiated. It kind of sounds like FirstLight is the boss and we're just here to iron out the wrinkles. This makes you feel better, but what would it take to do something meaningful?
I'm not sure I understand the question. For us to issue a denial?
What would it take to get you to do something other than to sign on the dotted line according to FirstLight?
Well, we could issue a denial, as I mentioned before. But the denial comes with all the risks that I mentioned before as well, which you have to consider.
In reality, that's not really an option you're considering, right? Because you're afraid of the liability.
It's an option. It's an option we're considering. And excuse me.
Please let him speak.
Excuse me. It is an option we are considering, and as I mentioned, it's an extremely complex decision. The question is, are you willing to risk litigation that goes on for years and years with an unpredictable outcome versus a certainty or almost certainty now? That's the question, and that's something that we are considering, that balance, which is what Mass Wildlife considered when they were agreeing on flows and what flows would be appropriate, considering balancing the interests. There is no perfect solution. I wish there were. I wish there were.
Okay, we have 5 minutes. We can take. I want to take questions from people who haven't gotten a chance to ask them. Yes, sir.
Just want to follow up on what the gentleman in front of me was driving at about the area around the intake for the Northfield Mountain pump storage. Tim, you mentioned that there's a limit of 10 to 20% of CFS reduction, I believe, in withdrawals.
Under the settlement agreement, the flows and fish settlement agreement.
Right. So I'm assuming that that's significantly less than what is happening now.
I don't think there's any limit now. I'm not sure, but I don't believe there's any limit. The limit is that they cannot lower the impoundment presently any lower than 176 feet below the level at the level of the dam.
Yeah, there may not be a limit, but I wonder if it's actually a reduction. The second part of it is the 10 to 20%, does that also apply to discharges that come down the hill and add CFS?
Does what apply?
Well, the system works both ways. You take, and then it comes back down. So does the 10 to 20% also pertain to the discharges that come down off the mountain.
This is for the settlement agreement you're talking about? I don't know the answer to that under the settlement agreement. I think there is, under the settlement agreement, I believe there is a provision that limits under certain circumstances the amount in the rate at which it can be discharged into the impoundment, I believe.
Okay, because it has effects both ways, coming out and going back.
I might have misunderstood what you said, Tim, but there's no limit for how much water can be taken up into the reservoir. There has not been and there will not be in the settlement agreements in terms of how much water can be pumped into the reservoir. That's the one.
My understanding is that the settlement agreement has a provision that limits the intake from the naturally routed flow to 10 to 20%, 20% under certain circumstances. That's the amount they can take.
Maybe I can lend some clarification. So that 10 to 20% of naturally routed flows. So naturally routed flows are the flows that are coming into the system from upstream, right? So that 10 to 20%, it's actually 99% of the time, it's within 10% naturally routed flows that must be discharged downstream of the project.
Right.
Right? So there's a little bit of wiggle room around that naturally routed flows to enable, I believe, again, I'm not an engineer, but allows FirstLight to better manage the impoundment and keep it within the bounds that they're required to keep it in. That 10% is about where it's around naturally routed flows being released downstream of the project through the dam, through Station 1, and through Cabot Station. And there's a certain number, it's actually a limited number of hours. I can't remember how many it is, but it's highly limited on a monthly basis, where they can actually go up to 20% up or down around that naturally routed flow number. But again, it's highly limited. I hope that adds clarification around that issue.
So we are hitting the witching hour by which we must conclude our meeting, lest our wonderful hosts will suffer the consequences. We still have note cards and we still have pencils. Please feel free to write your questions on your way out. I'll come back to the website as well, where you can post your questions and your comments. I think I'm sorry that we weren't able to answer everybody's questions tonight, but thank you all for being here, and we really appreciate your participation.